Hi everyone, and welcome to the Loneliness and Social Isolation in Mental Health Summer Showcase. I'm Sonia Johnson from UCL, Network Lead, and I've just got a few housekeeping messages before we get going. So one is, obviously, we'd like you to be muted, but we'd also, if you would be willing to keep your camera on, it's really nice to be able to see some people, so please do that if you can. Questions should, unless we're inviting people to speak during the discussion sections, please put your questions in the chat. If you've got any technical problems, please message Ellie Pearce privately, and she will no doubt succeed in sorting them out. There's going to be a link to the programme in the chat, and there's also going to be various introductions to speakers in the chat. We are recording all the sessions and we will make them available subsequently on our website. We'd love you to introduce yourselves in the chat so we've got some idea who's here today. Here's Mental Elf is tweeting, and so please do include Mental Elf and UCL Loneliness. These are the details basically. If you can include UCL Loneliness and MH Loneliness in any tweets, that would be great. And there are some video abstracts of some further pieces of research on our website. We'd love you to have a look. And so we don't have to keep letting people in and out. It'd be great if during breaks you could not actually leave the Zoom call, but just put your sound and video off. Okay, that's all from me, I think. I'm now going to hand over to Alexandra Pitman, who's going to tell you about our network over the past few years. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for that introduction, Sonia. So I'm going to share my screen. And I've got 15 minutes to tell you about the achievements of our network over the last 3.5 years, which we feel is quite a short period of time to talk through all the things that we feel we've achieved. And just to tell you a bit about who we are, we're a huge network of academics and practitioners, clinicians, voluntary sector organisations and people with lived experience, as well as policymakers who are really interested in the evidence that we're producing and collating, and obviously led by Sonia and myself, and also involving a team of co-investigators from universities across the UK. And our overarching aim throughout all of this has been to build UK capacity in loneliness research. And I really hope that you feel that we've done this specifically in relation to mental health, obviously. So in thinking about our achievements over the last few years, I conceptualized it in 3 main categories, really. So we're going to talk you through the research practices that we've established, also talked about some new findings, and talked about the evidence synthesis projects that we've been involved in. So first, the research practices. And I think the most notable achievement, I think, of this network has been the work of our co-production group. And I think of all 8 networks which were funded at the same time by UKRI to really build research in specific areas in relation to mental health, we're really regarded amongst those research networks as standing out for the work of our co-production group. And this involves 12 lived experience members who we recruited to work with us in advising us on what kind of meetings to hold, what kind of projects to work on. And also members of this group have been helping us plan events, presenting at events, as indeed they are today, co-facilitating, and also producing really valuable resources. And I'm going to mention these throughout this presentation, but they include some really interesting podcasts you can find on our website, as well as doing a really valuable qualitative consultation study, 2 of the papers for which have been published so far. So I think it's been fantastic for us to have our co-production group, particularly in advising on the PLUS projects, and which will be presented today. So this is frozen and I can't go down. There we go. So, we've had some really vibrant events over the last few years, and it has been really helpful for us to have the co-production group advising on how we run these events so that they are really as accessible as possible. And I do recommend you watch this particular co-video, which features Jackie and Sonia talking about the work of the network, and all these resources are available on our website, and we'll be tweeting them today. So I wanted to mention this co-produced qualitative research study. So lived experience researchers from our co-production group and also from the mental health policy research unit conducted interviews with 49 adults with pre-existing mental health conditions. And they conducted some really interesting interviews, which a group of us then analysed to explore experiences of loneliness before and during the pandemic. And these are a couple of papers that have been produced so far, so I urge you to read those. And there's also a very good mental health blog about this as well. Because of the experience we've had with the co-production group, we thought it would be helpful to write this kind of tips for running a lived experience group for any group of researchers in mental health. So again, that's a resource that was produced by our co-production group and is available on our website. And we've circulated that through the other research networks. Another approach that we feel particularly pleased with, it, which is obviously common to all of the research networks, is the very broad collaborations that we've established. And we've got a very broad membership, but we also cover a range of disciplines. And this is really important because the purpose of this capacity building exercise was to bring together various different research methodologies. And we've done that. And from my own experience as an epidemiologist, I'd love working with the built environment methodologists to think about how we can bring those perspectives together to understand loneliness in relation to the built environment and how that might impact on mental health. And each of us have our own experiences of learning about completely new methods in these cross-disciplinary collaborations. And I think that's been another very, very valuable approach of the network. We've also been very connected with all our members using, for example, our Twitter channel and also our Slack channel, and also sending out our newsletter to over 700 recipients, which we've had some really positive feedback on. And that's been a really good vehicle for establishing collaboration. So for example, people saying, I'm working on a grant application, I'd love to have people work with me on this, representing a range of disciplines. And we've really built some brilliant grant applications and papers based on those collaborations. Now, obviously, the way we've disseminated our research and ideas has changed a lot over the course of the last few years. And we started off with face-to-face events, and this was our launch event and the mental health question time panel that we had. But then we transitioned quite well to online events, and we had a number of events over the course. And I've only enumerated, about 16 here, but we also had a number of tweet chats as well. But what was great was with the pandemic, because we weren't limited geographically, it meant that actually more people, provided they had digital access, were able to participate. And we're still aware that digital access is a problem. And when we hold our co-production meetings, we do pay members a supplement to reflect the fact that it's harder to use digital resources sometimes. And we hope that that's something that researchers will think about when they're holding team meetings in relation to their own research studies. There we go. So just moving on to our PLUS projects. And this is another really important aspect of our approach, because we were essentially given by the UKRI about £500,000 for us to commission our own projects. And at the level that we were operating with the familiarity we had with the research landscape, it meant that we could fund some really interesting projects using perhaps smaller pots of money than the UKRI used to funding projects with. And we're going to hear today about the projects we awarded in the Pathways Fund and also in the Interventions Fund. And they were two separate commissioning calls. And how they differed was that the Pathways call was intended to look at the pathways between loneliness, social isolation, and mental health in a range of contexts. And then the Interventions Plus projects are intended to look at interventions to reduce loneliness and social isolation and promote mental health. So we've got some fantastic examples that we're going to hear about today. And again, I think what's important about the PLUS projects is that they also include the perspective of members of our co-production group, not only in planning the projects, but also in actually carrying out the research and thinking about how to disseminate it to wide audiences. So moving on to the second main theme here, we've produced some really fantastic resources. And I'm just starting here with a resource that our co-production produced, which pulled out some really good advice from the set of qualitative interviews we did with people with pre-existing mental health problems to give some really valuable tips on what to do when you feel lonely. And we've been circulating this as widely as possible, and we'd encourage you to do the same with your own clinical and research networks, please. All of our papers are published on our network website. And what's been great is that there's a really strong representation here from ECRs. So we started to meet with ECRs from the beginning of the network, and that's really taken a life of itself in terms of their activities and collaborations. And so many of the projects that we have been involved in and we've seen fantastic outputs from are conducted by ECRs. And it should be said that if you think about our PLOS projects, a lot of them are led by early career researchers, and also some are led by lived experience researchers. And we're already beginning to see some of the publications from those PLOS projects, as well as much more accessible lay summaries, which bring those findings to a much wider audience of stakeholders. So I'm just picking out Billy Lever-Taylor here and Angela Sweeney, and we're going to hear more about that study later. We've done some really great podcasts, and again, they're on our website. So I do urge you to listen to those whilst you go for a walk in the sunshine. And then moving finally on to the evidence synthesis aspect of this presentation. And we've done a lot of work on a range of umbrella reviews, rapid realist reviews, systematic reviews, and qualitative meta-syntheses, which are a way of synthesizing the qualitative evidence on a specific topic. And that was a completely new method for me. And these were intended to really try and understand the associations between loneliness or social isolation and mental health problems, and to summarize the evidence for interventions to address those in order to improve social connectedness and mental health. And of course, what's fantastic about doing these syntheses is that we identify where we don't know something yet. And that's been really important in identifying priority topics, in helping us be strategic about the kind of grants that we apply for. And that's been a way in which we've connected really well with policymakers on the network. And quite a number of us on the network were invited to join the government's Tackling Loneliness Strategy Evidence Group, and that's housed within the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And that was a really fantastic exercise in which we identified for them the evidence gaps in relation to loneliness and social isolation and mental health. And they are now going to set up a series of funding calls that address those specific gaps. So that's been a really great collaboration there. So finally, we've come to a point where we can think back at our objectives and consider whether we have actually addressed all these objectives. And I think, very much the work of the co-production group has helped integrate the perspective of people who have relevant lived experience. And I think a lot of us have learned a lot from that experience. We think we've really developed capacity amongst service users and ECRs, and amongst all of us in terms of understanding how to work in a more cross-disciplinary fashion. And we've used a range of channels to engage with the public. And that's been really helpful in thinking about how we can disseminate messages more widely. And also, as I mentioned, it's been great to feed directly into policy in the way we have done. What's been fantastic, and Catherine is involved today, is that the ECRs have created their own loneliness research network. And I'd encourage you to have a look at their website and join up. And also, it's been great to commission and oversee the series of PLOS projects that we funded and seen the progress that they've made, and look forward to seeing what they produce in the future in terms of those projects leading to larger grants. And then finally, these large grants, these are the prizes that we do have our eyes on, and we've really used this work to create some grant applications, some of which have been successful. So, for example, the Community Navigator grant, if you look that up on our website, you can read more about that there. We've also made a range of applications that address these particular priority groups, like, for example, young people who suffer from chronic loneliness. And we've also managed to get funding for a couple of doctoral fellowships. So that's great to see our pool of ECRs growing. So I've got three key messages really, and we do plan to maintain the momentum I've described here on all this capacity building. And you'll hear more about that at the end of today when we just round up the future of the network. But I think the other key message is that our co-production group have created this really valuable paradigm for how you address key questions in mental health research collaboratively. And I hope that that's a really important legacy of the network, not just for people interested in loneliness and mental health, but also people interested in a wide range of research questions. And finally, when we started out, there was a dominance of research into older people in relation to loneliness and mental health. And we feel that we've redressed that balance a bit more in looking at younger age groups. And of course, that helps think about how we can intervene earlier on to prevent chronic loneliness setting in. So thank you very much for coming today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing all the presentations today and hearing your thoughts in the discussion sessions. So I'm now going to hand over to James Cupp. James is a professor of epidemiology at UCL, and I'm just going to hand over to him now.
Thanks very much, Alexandra, and welcome everybody to today's event. As Alexandra said, I'm a professor of epidemiology. My role within the network is one of the co-investigators, and I'm particularly interested in looking at the experiences of social isolation and loneliness using big data sets to examine their relationship to mental health outcomes. So I'm going to be chairing the session on mapping the evidence and exploring lived experiences. We've got 4 great talks from 5 great speakers to let you know about, and I will, each talk is about 10 minutes each, and I'll give a verbal 2-minute warning to each speaker. They've got 2 minutes left to keep us on time. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Mary Birken. Mary is a research fellow in the Division of Psychiatry at UCL. And moreover, she, and many of you will know this, she was one of our network coordinators for the first 18 months, along with Ellie Pearce, and did a fantastic job of bringing our network together. So it's wonderful to have Mary back and speaking on with us today. The title of her talk is The Association Between Loneliness, Social Isolation, and Mental Health Problems, an Umbrella Review. Mary, over to you.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here, and yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and yeah, it's great to be presenting this study. So I guess the first thing to say is that I'm presenting the study on behalf of a much larger research team that's been involved in this study, developing the protocol, doing the searches, quality appraisal, yeah, so many different aspects of this large study, so I'm presenting it on behalf of everybody. So the aim of our study, which is a systematic review of systematic reviews, and we aimed to produce a comprehensive overview of the evidence on the association between a full range of concepts related to loneliness and social isolation at the individual level and mental health problems. And we wanted to look at that from the perspective of people with using mental health services and the general population. And in summary, we wanted to provide an overview of the evidence. We wanted to look at the gaps in the evidence, and we wanted to look at the quality of the evidence, and that's including the quality of the reviews, but also including the quality of the papers within those reviews. So following putting our protocol on Prospero, we conducted a search of 5 databases, and we also did searches of databases of systematic reviews and systematic reviews protocols. And we also looked up the evidence synthesis journal. We had a range of researchers that were reviewers in the study, but everyone was sort of independent of each other in terms of screening and quality appraisals and different aspects of the study. So for quality appraisal, we use the AMSTAR tool, which is a critical appraisal tool for systematic reviews. And we've searched up the literature up until January 2022. So in terms of our eligibility criteria of studies, we wanted to include studies that looked at quantitative associations. And we wanted to look at studies that included individual level social concepts. So they include loneliness, social isolation, social support, social network, individual social capital. So they were a range of interrelated social concepts rather than just loneliness. We excluded studies that looked at dementia, learning difficulties, general well-being, and suicide-related outcomes. And we also excluded studies that had a primary physical health diagnosis focus. So we wanted just to focus on mental health. And just before I move on to our results, I just want to say that we're still work in progress. So I'd be very grateful if you please don't tweet our results or screenshot any of the slides I'm going to show you. So overall, we found 53 eligible reviews, and that shows you just the amount of work that went into sifting and looking at reviews. So these were 53 systematic reviews covering this area. And the majority of included studies in those reviews were cross-sectional. So in terms of depression, we found 29 reviews, and we found 8 focusing on perinatal area. So loneliness was consistently found to be associated with depression across the lifestyle, and that was found in meta-analysis to have a moderate effect. Social support was also found to be a protective factor from depression, and low social support was a risk factor for depressive symptoms with a moderate effect in one meta-analysis. But just to say, possibly not after experiencing sudden violence or bereavement. The studies in social support and in relation to depression covered across the lifespan. Some looked at specific groups like immigrant women or LGBTQ young people. And a lot of the studies focus on perceived social support. We found limited evidence that social isolation is associated with depression. That was mainly because the reviews didn't contain that many studies in that area. And we found one review that didn't distinguish between loneliness and social isolation. We found inconsistent evidence that social network size is associated with depression, but some evidence that a large, diverse network can be a protective factor. And in terms of perinatal depression, we found that this was consistently found to be linked to low social support. And 3 studies focused on sort of general population. In terms of anxiety, we found 6 reviews, again, one focusing on perinatal area. Loneliness was found to be associated with anxiety in 3 reviews, and one review didn't look at loneliness, didn't distinguish between loneliness and social isolation. We also found some evidence that low social support is associated with anxiety, and in particular perinatal anxiety and social anxiety disorder. No reviews looked at social isolation or social networks specifically, and only 2 reviews focused on clinical populations. And within these studies or reviews around anxiety, we found 2 that focused on young people. We found 6 studies looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, and they found that social support was consistently found to be negatively associated with post-traumatic stress symptoms. That is, the lower level of social support, the worse the symptoms. However, we found one study that didn't find this association. And interesting, there was no other reviews looking at any other social relational concepts in the area of post-traumatic stress disorder. And one review focused on a clinical population with others focusing on specific areas such as veterans. In terms of psychosis, we found 7 reviews and 3 looked at bipolar. And loneliness was moderately associated with psychotic symptoms in 2 meta-analyses. It was also found that in people with psychosis, loneliness may be associated with greater depression symptoms. Social network size seemed to be negatively associated with symptom severity, and meta-analysis suggests a moderate effect. One review found some support for associations between social support and psychotic symptoms in the general population sample. And there was also some studies of this in clinical populations. Again, we found no reviews looked at other social concepts apart from loneliness and social network and social support. And all reviews focused on clinical populations, with only one including general population samples with psychotic symptoms. So we found one review on eating disorders, and this review found some evidence that individuals diagnosed with eating disorders or individuals with symptoms in the general population have lower social support than controls. We also, given the sort of timeline of the study, we found some studies that in the context of COVID-19. So we found 3 reviews that looked at experiences during COVID. And cross-sectional data suggested that having social support was linked to lower anxiety and depression in adults. and this was specifically pregnant women during COVID. And also we found that social isolation was associated with worse symptoms in adults with eating disorders who were confined at home with family members.
Mary, that's 2 minutes.
Okay. So in conclusion, we found around 55% of the studies were reviews looking at depression. Social support, it was the most common. Sorry, I'm just going to move. All right, just going to move my screen over there. So we found that social support was the most often studied individual level social relationship concept. And only social support studies have been reviewed in relation to post-traumatic stress disorder and eating disorders. Most of the studies that we found, most of the reviews focus on the general population, including specific demographics rather than clinical populations. And there may be empirical studies to fill these gaps, but they haven't come into systematic reviews yet, so we wouldn't have found them. Overall, having inadequate social support, small social networks, and feeling isolated and lonely does seem to be consistently linked with worse mental health across different demographic groups. So that's the end of my presentation. And if you would like some more information about the study, you can contact Ellie at the Loneliness Network in UCL. So yeah, thank you very much.
Mary, thank you, and thank you for a wonderful overview of absolutely enormous review of the literature in this field. It's going to be really influential and important, I think. If people do have questions for Mary, then we encourage you to put them in the chat, and Mary and the other speakers will try and respond to those questions during the morning. So we'll now move on to our next speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Farhana Mann. Farhana is a research training fellow in the Division of Psychiatry at UCL. And today she's going to be talking to us about loneliness and the onset of new mental health problems in the general population, a systematic review. So Farhana, 10 minutes from whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Just trying to go back a slide. There we go. Thanks very much, James. Yes, I'm Farhana, and I'm a Wellcome Clinical Research Training Fellow. My background is as a psychiatrist, and I'm based at UCL. And I'm happy to share with you the findings and a kind of overview of our systematic review and meta-analysis on loneliness and the onset of new mental health problems in the general population. So although you'll probably all be very familiar with this, just in case you're not, obviously when we set out to do any kind of systematic review or scientifically kind of answer a specific question, we have to define what it is we're asking about. So when we talk about loneliness here, we're talking about a mismatch in your social connectedness between what you want and what you perceive that you have. It's subjective. It is by definition distressing or unpleasant. So it's not a sort of happy state of solitude, for example, and it's both quantity and quality. And of course, as we saw with Mary's presentation as well, there are many other concepts that are related, and this paper in the corner that I've mentioned there is one that you could look at to explore those other concepts. But here I was looking specifically at loneliness. When I first became interested in the topic as a junior doctor, meeting people in clinic and sort of recognizing the impact of different sort of social settings that people were in on their general well-being and their symptoms. And when I first started talking to Sonia about working on this topic, obviously we looked at what the evidence was around loneliness and health in general. And there are many associations, as you saw, Mary mentioned many with mental health, but also I was surprised back then that the vast majority of literature in loneliness was actually more in physical health. So heart problems, immune system, aberrant immune system function, high risk of premature mortality from all causes. And so I was interested to see that although it seemed obvious to look at it, there wasn't as much on mental health problems. And there are also other areas that people have looked at, including how expensive it is and how much loneliness costs. And a lot of this stuff, as again, Mary highlighted, is cross-sectional. So it's a snapshot of two things being connected to each other, but not necessarily what happens over time. So this is not necessarily a particularly lonely chick or lonely egg, but rather to show the sort of chicken and egg issue of if we know that two things are associated, is that enough? And really, if you're going to intervene or start to understand the relationship, you want to look at things over time to understand if the loneliness, for example, means that you then become more likely to become unwell, or whether if you have depression, for example, it's the other way, that something about the way you're interacting with yourself or other people means that you become more lonely. So that led to couple of linked systematic reviews, but this is the one I'm talking about today, which is recently published. But we asked the question, is loneliness linked to people developing new mental health problems in the general population over time? So if you know what their loneliness level is at baseline and they don't have mental health problems at baseline, and you follow them up, are they more likely to develop mental health problems if they're lonely, for example, compared with people who are not? And so that's the paper, which is out now, and it's open access, so you can use that link or just Google it and it should come up and you can have a look at the full paper. Obviously, we had to be very thorough. The whole purpose of a systematic review is that you answer the question in a very thorough, structured way, as opposed to Googling it, I suppose. So we searched through 6 electronic databases and looked at unpublished literature and hand-searched references covering dates up to and including August 2021. So there was some cover of pandemic, and it was pre-registered so that we kind of set out what we wanted to do before we had all of the information. So in just briefly covering who we covered, it's always a bit of a balance because you want to be able to generalize, but you also want to answer a specific question. So you can't include everything and everybody, but we included adults and we were looking at the general population in this review. We specified that we wanted studies that followed people up over the time. So they needed to be quantitative longitudinal studies to be included. They needed to measure loneliness at baseline and have a sort of formal measurement of mental health outcome. And we assess the quality of all the papers. This is a freely accessible tool, so you can have a look at all of the questions that we use. So each of the papers that we would include would have to be assessed independently by different raters on quality, so that you know that the conclusions you draw are based on good quality or not original research. So obviously don't worry too much about the detail on the side, that is all in the paper itself. But if you focus on just the red numbers, we started with about 33,000 titles using the terms that we used, and we were deliberately more broad than you need to be so that you capture everything. And then you start to screen, and we got to just over 1,000 papers we went through the full texts of in more detail, independently checked by raters, and ended up with 2 full tests. And meta-analysis, I'm sure most of you will be familiar with them if not done them yourselves, but if you don't, then it's just a sort of quantifying the conclusions and pooling together and coming up with an overall number. And you have to be very specific about what you pool together. So there were 7 that met criteria for that. So overall, 32 studies, vast majority were on depression, and that's interesting in the loneliness literature in general, that tends to be what we've seen, although it is shifting. There were studies looking at anxiety specifically, some more broadly on common mental disorder and others on suicidal ideation. Average number of people in studies was about 21,000, so not too small, but they did vary from 34 through to over 500,000. Overall, if you put the total number of all of the studies and cohorts included, it was more than 650,000 people. Average follow-up, again, big range, but average was about 5 years of follow-up. It was good to see that in more recent years, the papers included younger adults more and more. So the older papers tended to typically always be over 50s, but about half of our overall included studies were older people. The UCLA loneliness scale was most commonly used, and the quality was mostly moderate to good. In terms of what we found, what we saw was loneliness at baseline is associated with an increased risk of new cases of depression over time. So if you follow people up, they didn't have depression at baseline, loneliness does seem to be associated with them being more likely than those who were not lonely to develop depression. And the pooled adjusted odds ratio was 2.33. So broadly, you could say that more than double the risk if you were lonely versus not lonely in the general population. Fewer studies looking at anxiety specifically, but picking one of those out, which was pretty good quality, followed people up over 21 years, the adjusted odds ratio was 3.53. So you're looking at broadly more than 3 times the risk, or 3.5 times the risk of developing anxiety disorder over time if you were lonely versus not lonely, or only sometimes or not lonely. We also saw that in the studies, there were not very many of them, but those that looked at common mental disorder, less clear for suicidal ideation, very few studies, and it wasn't consistent. One found and one didn't. There was nothing, and no longitudinal studies that we found looking at psychosis onset or developing personality disorder or personality disorder diagnoses, which is interesting because I know Mary mentioned some, but those will all be cross-sectional. There are obviously practical reasons for that, given the incidence of psychosis, the number of new cases is much lower in a given year compared with depression. So that may be partly why. But just briefly looking at this figure, just to highlight what we found. So from the paper, you can see that basically focusing on the diamond at the bottom, which is the pooling together of all of these findings by adjusting for their size and various things, gives you that 2.33 number. So the bold line in the middle is no effect, and you can see that it's over to the right. And even the studies that measured loneliness slightly differently, so with a continuous scale where you look at how much the risk increases every time you go up in a point of loneliness, you also saw that there was a higher likelihood of you getting depression later on if you were lonely, more lonely. So overall, I haven't covered everything, but we concluded that loneliness is an important public mental health issue. And there's evidence to support its association with people in the general population developing new mental health problems, even after adjusting for other relevant factors. We did find that the studies that looked at it did see a reciprocal relationship with depression. So it wasn't as straightforward as one coming before the other, but that if you're lonely, you're more likely to develop depression. But it was also the case the other way, that if you were depressed, you would also be more likely to become lonely over time. They obviously found associations in older people, but what was good is that we were seeing more studies in groups like university students, where we also saw this association, new mothers and young adults in general. There are lots of gaps identified. As we move towards kind of understanding causality, need to better understand the mechanisms involved, which I won't go into here, of course, but also understand the role of loneliness in specific groups that aren't as well represented in this research. So not to sort of just extrapolate from findings in depression and then just apply them to all people with mental health problems. We don't fully understand the experiences and how it works in different people. The need for methodologically robust studies, also outside of Europe and the US setting. Haven't gone into detail here about sort of cultural settings that the studies tend to be conducted in. Also understanding at which point loneliness becomes a problem. For example, is it baseline loneliness? Is that an issue because it's a persistent thing over time, or is it a short period of more severe loneliness? So those are the things that need to be better understood if we're going to be looking at interventions and things like that. Also establishing whether these measures, and most of them do use the UCLA loneliness scale, are they the most appropriate measures for people with more severe psychosis, for example? And we have seen studies cross-sectionally that suggest people with psychosis may not report loneliness, but may report isolation. That doesn't mean they necessarily aren't feeling lonely, but is it something that we need to think about in terms of the measures? And obviously,
final minute left, Farhana.
Yeah, I won't go into detail with this. This is from another paper from 2017, where we looked at interventions, and obviously when we establish something that we consider a risk factor, the question is, what do we do about it? And this paper from 2017, also in SPPE, which is open access, looks at our thoughts on broadly different levels at which you could intervene in a problem like this. And this is also a related review that looks at loneliness in people who already have mental health problems, that was slightly older, but you might want to have a look at that. So yes, thank you very much for listening, and to all my co-authors and the team. And that's the paper itself.
Thank you, Farhana. That is wonderful to see published evidence of quite strong associations between loneliness and new onset cases of common mental disorders, at least. So a wonderful overview. Thank you. There are questions in the chat that I'm sure you want to pick up on, and please do keep those questions coming in the chat if you've got more questions. I'll move immediately on to our next speaker, who literally needs no introduction. Our next speaker is Dr. Ellie Pearce, who most of you will know as the other network coordinator and senior research fellow in the Division of Psychiatry, who has been keeping the Loneliness Network in great shape from the very start. We're delighted to have her here speaking to us today on loneliness as an active ingredient in preventing or alleviating youth anxiety and depression, a critical interpretive synthesis incorporating principles from rapid realist reviews. So 10 minutes, please, Ellie. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, James. So this is work done by a number of network members and funded by the Wellcome Trust. So longitudinal evidence suggests that childhood loneliness predicts increased risk of depression and emotional symptoms up to 24 years later. And there's a negative feedback loop between loneliness and social anxiety in adolescence over time. Loneliness has also been found to mediate the relationship between anxiety and depression in both school-based samples and young people in residential mental health care settings. So it seems plausible that by addressing chronic loneliness, we might be able to prevent or alleviate anxiety and/or depression in young people. So our research questions in this review are: in which ways and in which contexts does addressing loneliness appear to prevent and/or improve anxiety and depression in young people, and why? And in which ways and in which contexts and for whom does addressing loneliness appear not to work, and why? So our new searches of academic research literature involved a predefined research strategy registered on Prospero, and we had feedback from academic experts and young people with lived experience, which led to further iterations of more targeted searches, for example, for papers related to stigma and to eating disorders. We also included papers in the 14 to 24-year-old age range related to loneliness and mental health outcomes from a systematic review conducted by Alice Eccles and Pam Qualter, and another systematic review by Rumin Ma and colleagues, as well as 2 unpublished MSc projects that report interviews with third sector staff about youth loneliness. And then we also included reports and resources from the third sector and policymakers. We conducted a critical interpretive synthesis that included principles of rapid realist review. And what that really means is that we took themes from discussions with our lived experience group of young people, and we coded the academic and grey literature based on those themes. And from that, we extracted what are called synthetic constructs, which are basically overarching concepts that encompass the evidence from different sources. And we combined these constructs into a conceptual framework, which we then took back to our lived experience group for feedback. And through several iterations of this, we developed our final framework. So based on our research questions, 3 main constructs were synthesized from the evidence, which are context, i.e. who interventions might work for in terms of different causes of loneliness, content, or the key elements of interventions, and mechanisms of action, or why certain elements might be effective for particular people. And then across these, we have intrapersonal, interpersonal, and social constructs. So intrapersonal contextual factors underlying loneliness are things like psychological barriers, such as not trusting others, low self-esteem, whether an individual is already experiencing anxiety or depression. Intrapersonal strategies include, for example, cognitive behavioural therapy or self-help strategies like self-help apps, sport, or using social media. And then plausible intrapersonal mechanisms are creating more positive ways of looking at themselves and others, building purpose and building identity. Interpersonal contextual factors underlying loneliness are lacking social skills and lacking confidence. And interpersonal strategies aim to improve those social skills, and that may work through building social skills, confidence, and trust. Social contextual factors are lacking close relationships with friends or family, or not feeling part of a wider social network or community. And social strategies include increasing social support, for example, through peer support groups or having mentors, or providing opportunities for social engagement. So for example, through music making or playing sports. And these strategies can allow individuals to build meaningful relationships and realize that they aren't the only ones feeling like they do. Of course, there are also socioeconomic factors underlying loneliness, but in this framework, we focus on these intrapersonal, interpersonal, and social pathways. And then a key element of effective intervention seems to be that they are co-designed and personalised to respond to individual needs. So the content construct can be seen a bit like a menu to choose from, depending on which contextual factors resonates for a particular individual. We also looked at potential barriers, i.e. what factors might mean that interventions might not work for someone. And these include individual level psychological barriers or situational barriers like work or caring responsibilities, practical barriers such as digital, physical, or financial exclusion, and social barriers such as stigma or having an unsupportive home environment. Our lived experience group talked about strategies needing to be co-designed to fit the needs of the individual, and interventions may need to incorporate multiple content elements from the framework to be effective. For example, the online Entourage platform uses a strength-based cognitive therapy approach to helping young people overcome social anxiety, but it also has peer and professional mentors to provide social support. The few studies that measured loneliness outcomes after social skills training were targeted at individuals with autism spectrum disorder or social anxiety, so we don't really know whether this approach is more broadly applicable. Changing thinking around attitudes to self and others through therapy and building trust through having ongoing social support seem to help young people already experiencing anxiety or depression. Having supportive social groups that had a shared experience, for example, hospitalised young people doing music therapy together, or online forums for depressed university students, seem to help reduce loneliness. The key mechanisms of action here was recognising that shared experience and realising that you're not the only one feeling that way. It's plausible that some of these groups may have also helped build identity and inadvertently helped build social skills and social confidence. So overall, the most promising approach may be interventions that flexibly combine or offer the choice of some form of cognitive therapy, sustained social support, and perhaps that needs to be one-to-one for the individuals already experiencing severe anxiety or depression, and peer groups that share specific shared experiences such as bereavement or being an overseas student.
2 minutes, Ellie.
Thank you. So we need more properly powered trials, particularly targeting chronically lonely young people, and trials that measure anxiety and depression as well as loneliness outcomes. And other areas for potential interventions that were raised by our academic or lived experience experts, but weren't addressed in the research literature that we looked at, were those involving the built environment, the stigma of loneliness and mental ill health, interventions involving building identity, positive family relationships, and addressing cognitive biases which are known to be associated with loneliness, such as hypersensitivity to social threat. So the emerging evidence we have is unclear at the moment on which strategies have significant outcomes for whom specifically, but therapeutic approaches and social support may help those with existing social anxiety or depression. And the lived experience group suggested that therapy might pave the way for them being able to take advantage of opportunities to socialise, for example, community activities. Any of the strategies might help reduce loneliness and prevent anxiety or depression. In particular, ongoing social support, peer groups to share experiences, and changing thinking about self and others. And it was really clear that supported co-design of interventions is valued by young people and advocated by charities. So effective strategies might require several content components from the framework we've suggested. And overall, evidence so far suggests that a range of interventions can reduce loneliness in young people and may have the potential then to both prevent and alleviate anxiety and depression. So I want to say thank you to the funders, particularly to our fantastic group of young people with lived experience, and to the academic experts that also fed into this review. We've got some references, and this has been published. I think Millie's put the link in the chat. Great, I'll hand back to James to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you for an interesting talk on both the theory and the importance of co-production in all the work we do around interventions and loneliness. And our final talk of this section, of this session, will actually be by two members from our co-production groups, who will be talking about the role of co-production in more detail. So I'm delighted to welcome Bev, who is a member of our network co-production group, and Patrick, who is a member of the NIHR Mental Health Policy Research Unit Lived Experience Working Group, who will be talking about experiences of loneliness among people experiencing mental ill health, an interview study. So Bev and Patrick, over to you for your 10-minute talk.
Thank you, James. Hi, everyone. I'm Patrick. I'll be presenting with Bev Chip, like has been said, who is a member of the Loneliness and Social Isolation in Mental Health Research Network Coproduction Group. And it's worth noting, like as has been said, we're both lived experience researchers of this project. And just to acknowledge, we're presenting this following work on behalf of 14 other colleagues. This has been a team effort. A bit of background, there's now quite a lot of quantitative research looking at the link between loneliness and mental ill health, both in the general population and in people already experiencing mental ill health. However, there isn't so much in the way of more in-depth qualitative research on the lived experiences of loneliness from the perspective of people who are also experiencing mental health problems. Understanding how people actually experience loneliness and whether they experience it as related to their mental health could provide insights into how to best address their loneliness, as well as whether current quantitative measures of loneliness are really appropriate for capturing this experience. Just as we were starting to conduct interviews in March 2020, we went into the first lockdown and expanded the remit of the study to include questions about the impact of COVID-19. However, the second part of the interview stayed the same, and we asked about experiences of loneliness in general, not specifically in relation to COVID-19, which was covered to some extent in the first part of the interview. So although we collected these data during the pandemic, the themes Bev will present relate to loneliness more broadly, not just to loneliness in lockdown. And it has been mentioned, we took a co-production approach throughout the study, from planning and conducting the interviews to the analysis and writing up the research for publication. And just a bit about the methods. Next slide. As well as the lived experience researchers, the team of academic researchers includes experts in a range of disciplines, as well as clinicians. We recruited through community organizations and did some targeted recruitment to make sure we had a good range of participants, all of whom had experienced mental ill health. The lived experience researchers conducted semi-structured interviews, and we switched these from face-to-face in the community to telephone and video calls due to COVID. And for analysis, 5 of the team, 4 of whom are lived experience researchers, analyzed the interviews inductively using a bottom-up approach where themes were identified from the interview transcripts. Themes were developed iteratively through discussion within the core coding group, as well as with the wider team. Now over to the inspirational, all-knowing Bev.
Thanks, Patrick. Hi, so you'll notice that we started interviewing in March 2020, which meant that lockdown hit us at a very early point. So almost all of the interviews took place by phone or video. We used purposive sampling to ensure there was diversity regarding participants' diagnoses, use of mental health services, demographic characteristics regarding age, sex, ethnicity, and sexuality, and whether they lived in rural or urban areas. It was a real challenge to get balanced ratios across all of these areas, but we ensured that we had good representation of diverse ethnic populations. Using interviewers with lived experience seemed to really help the rapport with the interviewees and gave us some really rich transcripts. After lots of team discussion and analysis, there were a handful of themes that emerged. In the following slides, we'll just pick out a few of the points for you under each theme. The first theme, what did the word lonely mean to participants? Our opening question was, what does the word lonely mean to you? And we retained that concept for this theme due to the wide variety of ways that the question was interpreted, including by definition, anecdote, relation and connection, emotions, and surprisingly, a range of actual physical sensations. A key takeaway here then is that lonely can mean many things to different people, and that must be considered in any future research. The classic error is to equate loneliness with isolation, but for many people, it was more about not feeling connected. What it was important to connect with varied from person to person. In terms of relationships, pets could be on par with humans. Connection to nature and spirituality also came up. Starkly, in this second quote here, there is a disconnect that she's lived with since she was a teenager. The last 35 years has been lonely. I mean, I've got a husband, I've got 4 kids and everything else, but that doesn't stop you from feeling lonely. Now, you can imagine how much social interaction someone has living with 4 kids and a husband, and yet still she was lonely. This subject has suffered abuse as a child and found it hard to even be present with herself. When she was left alone, she said she would just knock herself out with sleeping pills and go to bed. Next slide, please. The second theme was contributory factors to loneliness. We learned that loneliness could stem from internal or from external causes. However, it's also possible that the internal causes could have had an external root at some earlier point in life. Our past experiences and life events do shape us and can leave scars. Some of the things that participants mentioned, which they thought could be related to their current loneliness, included loss, sexual abuse, bereavement, and domestic violence. These are external events that subjects had no control over. Internal causes could be issues of self-confidence, thought patterns, and inner dialogues. Look at this second quote. Sometimes she feels comfortable to go up to people and actually interrupt to join in the conversation. They do have the social skills. They've done it before. But these negative mental scripts can disable and get in the way of engaging with people. Assumptions can be dangerous. There was another participant who, if he thought someone wasn't interested in him, would then start to be very critical of himself, repeating negative thoughts over and over until he was really quite depressed. There are other contributory factors. A sense of belonging was important to some participants, and to not feel like they were an outsider. For this Black African participant, being different was not about colour, but class. Socioeconomic class came up a few times, in fact. With this quote, it's a reminder too that our work environment might be a whole different world to our home and social environment, and we can have different experiences in each. And generally, we only have control over one of those. The impact of time spent alone was complex. It wasn't all bad. Living with mental health could mean some need for social withdrawal to manage pressures and protect your own well-being, but it can also lead to self-destructive patterns and loss of social confidence. Having the insight of participant 8 into that fine balance is both a blessing and an art. Some people cherished their me time and found it centering and good for their relationship with themselves, making them feel less lonely. The lockdown and closure of many mental health services meant people had to be resourceful and turn to self-help strategies, books, and online groups, sometimes discovering things that worked for them, which had not been provided by the statutory services, such as crafting, spending time in nature, or even shamanic journeying. In the third theme, we looked at the relationship between loneliness and mental health. We already knew there was a correlation between mental health and loneliness, but which causes which? We learned that there's a bidirectional relationship where either one could have caused the other. And for some people, this was actually cyclical. You can see how loneliness could lead to depression in this first quote. If you feel bad for a prolonged period of time, then reactive depression might naturally follow. This would be one of the simplest explanations. In this second quote, how mental ill health led to loneliness is twofold. Sitting on your own in the dark at night isn't compatible with maintaining a vibrant social life. And then, if you deteriorate to the point where your personal hygiene isn't the best, then perhaps even the more loyal friends who'd been coming to see you might just stop wanting to do that. It's a double whammy. Paranoia could lead you to withdraw from people, and also psychosis could, but not always in an unpleasant way, with some participants entering their own little world and just being disinterested in their mundane friends. Some people lost friends when they were unwell, if the friends found them difficult to deal with during those times and withdrew. Some participants didn't want to repair the friendship later on, or described it as being different now, despite attempts by the friends to make up with them. And last but not least, our fourth theme. We concluded the interviews by asking participants what they thought would be most helpful in reducing loneliness, and they came up with a lot of good suggestions. During the interviews, it was heartening to hear how eager participants were to pass on their tips to help others, and in sharing these, their mood often brightened after a more somber hour of reflections. Structured socialization was key for participant 5. You have to have a plan. And if you know yourself well, perhaps even a cunning plan. I love the positivity, certainty, and encouragement in this other quote. Try and communicate with people, even if it's going to Kew Gardens by yourself. You're going to meet people when you sit down at the cafe, and they're going to say to you, "Isn't the weather lovely?" Even the briefest of encounters can be significant. Just get out there and open yourself to possibility. even speaking to cashiers rather than using automated tills. One participant particularly missed saying hello and goodbye to the librarian. Even these micro connections were important. Finding something like a hobby that connects you with something or something you enjoy to give a bit of routine or something else to focus on rather than moping. We've said that loneliness was not just about connections to other people, but also to meaningful activity and self. So all hobbies are good. At the very least, it's something to focus on and distract you, but you might find that it connects you with happier parts of yourself. Volunteering gives both purpose and connection with people, a double win. The feeling you can get from doing good is priceless, and as participant 9 found, potentially life-changing. And back to Patrick.
Thanks, Bev. There was variation in the origins and experience of loneliness described by participants. Mainly, loneliness was often seen as being about lack of connection, including to oneself, to spiritual or religious faith, animals and nature. So it's not just about a lack of connection with people. And loneliness could be felt as a different physical sensation, even if it's not identified as loneliness. We think this is helpful for people like, for example, GPs know, so they can help people unpick this experience and support them to address their loneliness. And there was also variation in the approaches taken to reduce loneliness. For some participants, addressing their loneliness wasn't just about meeting lots of people, but the right people. Having shared interests mattered. Reducing loneliness could also be about understanding yourself, finding meaning and purpose, learning what you want to do. Social contact was key for many people, but there was variation in how that social contact was found. For example, walking the dog alone and chatting to strangers or acquaintances. For others, going to groups helped. Mental health problems could be a limiting factor in maintaining social relationships. Many aspects to this, for example, consistency, on and off times, stigma and symptoms. And psychological therapy was helpful for some people as a first step towards then being able to address their loneliness through meeting people. A key message is that alleviation of loneliness is not a binary phenomenon. People may experience temporary alleviation, but then become lonely again. And well, many thanks. And as Bev mentioned earlier, people wanted to share ways of helping others. So we co-produced a booklet based on people's suggestions. The link is here, as you can see on the last slide, and will be shared with you in the chat, I think. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you so much, Bev. A really wonderful way to end the session, and an example really not just of co-produced research, but research led by people with lived experience from the very beginning. And it was really powerful work and really important findings, I think, there that tie into the earlier 3 talks we had, which were more from the sort of review of the science and so forth. So really wonderful way to end our session. Thank you to all 5 of our speakers across those 4 talks. We're now going to have a quick 10-minute break so you can get some fresh air, have a cup of tea, etc. We'll meet back at 11:15, and we'll be hearing from Professor Sonia Johnson, who will be talking about loneliness as a potential target for interventions to improve mental health, what we know and what we may need to know. So once again, thank you very much to all our speakers, and have a good break for 10 minutes.
Okay, so I'm hoping that there are people out there and that people have come back from making their cup of tea. It's one of the disadvantages of Zoom that you never actually quite know who's out there in your audience. But I'm going to give a short talk that's really intended to lead into the discussion and to lead towards our afternoon intervention sessions. I'm going to just try and take an overview of what we know so far about loneliness as a potential target for interventions that are aimed at improving mental health, and what we might need to know to develop some strategies for helping people with mental health problems with loneliness. And I'm going to make quite a few sweeping statements, giving the amount of ground covered in a few minutes. So I'll be very happy to hear some people disagree or question what I'm saying or take different points of view. But here's an attempt at summarising where we maybe are currently. So this is what I'm going to talk about, what's exciting about social interventions from the perspective of hoping to improve mental health and mental health care. What I think we know so far and what it would be most helpful to know next about connections between loneliness and mental health in order to underpin strategies for helping people with loneliness. And I'm also going to say a bit about why doing something about loneliness is quite challenging and why the sort of cross-disciplinary and co-produced strategies that we've aimed to support in this network might be particularly important. So just taking a step back, social interventions in mental health are in a curious place, really, because we've known for probably 100 years or more that there's a really close relationship with mental illness, between mental illness and social adversity. However, when you look at recommendations about how to help people with mental health conditions, they largely consist of pharmacological and psychological recommendations, not of recommendations for social forms of help. And likewise, in public mental health, so in prevention in mental health, there's been lots of interest in potential social targets for preventive interventions. But if you try and look what has got a really long way, what's ready to roll out and evidence-based, there's not really all that much. So why be excited about this as potential? Well, I'd suggest that at least for serious conditions like psychosis and bipolar, if you look at the extent to which prognosis has improved over the last few decades, there are a few literature reviews of this, and they tend to come to rather depressing conclusions that in terms at least of things like symptoms and how well people function, things haven't actually changed very much over the last few decades. Whereas if you look at things like cancer or heart disease or other kinds of long-term conditions, things have got a lot better. Social interventions tend to be highly rated by service users as potential forms of help. And so there are reasons to believe that social interventions like those focused on loneliness are a new opportunity to shift the needle and try and really improve outcomes for people with mental health problems. So what do we know overall? First of all, are loneliness and social isolation problems for people with mental health conditions? As Mary described, higher rates of loneliness and social isolation have been described in almost all mental health conditions, and the links seem especially close and are probably a bit circular in common mental disorders like depression and anxiety. And there's a bit of work a couple of our postgraduate students are currently doing, looking at the literature on people who've got a diagnosis of personality disorder that suggests that really the links may be especially close with lack of social connection for people with those conditions, however one might, whatever terminology one wants to use for them. And there's a lot of discussion about whether these links are causal, but in some senses it doesn't really matter, I would suggest, in that we know that there are a lot of loneliness is inherently distressing and also associated with a lot of adverse physical health consequences. So actually, even if we can't show really robust longitudinal associations for other conditions, like the ones Farhana's talked about for depression, which do seem quite robust, I think there's reason to suggest that in any case, it's the high rates of loneliness are not a good thing and an indication for thinking what might help. So to what extent can we argue that loneliness actually causes mental health problems? Well, I think it's, as Farhana's already suggested, the evidence is strongest in depression and potentially anxiety. And that there's also evidence linking lack of social support with perinatal depression. These really are probably the most important focuses for preventive interventions, for trying to intervene with loneliness, to try and stop people developing a mental health condition in the first place. Does loneliness make things worse or make recovery slower from once people have got a mental health condition? There's a link here, and I think there's going to be one in the chat, to a review that a PhD student of mine called Jingyi Wang did, and some other epidemiological work that she and Rimin Ma did, that suggests that at least for depression, there is considerable evidence that people recover less well if they're lonely. And that if you look at people who are persistently lonely, at mental health service users who are persistently lonely at several points in time, it seems that they don't do that well, that their outcomes aren't that good on several measures. Are the experiences of loneliness among people with mental health problems distinctive? Well, as people have already described, there are aspects of loneliness among people with mental health problems that are pretty similar to other people. It's about both lack of local close connections and lack of sense of a belonging. And there are some drivers like losses and transitions that are pretty universal. But if we're looking for distinctive aspects, there are some direct effects of mental health conditions, things like paranoia and depression and social anxiety, that might contribute to loneliness. There are also some ways in which loneliness and mental health problems have maybe common origins, for instance, in adverse childhood experiences. The relationship can be quite complex in that a lot of people describe feeling a need sometimes to withdraw from other people to cope with mental health problems, but then that can exacerbate the mental health problems by exacerbating loneliness. The impacts of stigma and self-stigma and social exclusion seem important. So do the practical obstacles like social and material deprivation that can prevent people from connecting with other people. It's important to think about intersectional factors, so that people with mental health problems are particularly likely to belong to minorities who may also experience greater loneliness. And it may be important, there's some emerging evidence that chronic loneliness, that being persistently lonely over a long time, might have a particular relevance, not surprisingly, to mental health. So looking, what do we still need to know? Well, for preventive interventions, it would be good to have a better sense of which lonely people are at risk of mental health problems. It'd be good to know more about these longitudinal relationships, about cause and effect, although for conditions like psychosis, it may prove quite difficult to really show the extent to which loneliness might contribute to causing psychosis, because actually there's so many other factors. I suspect, and there's not very good longitudinal studies, I suspect it's going to prove quite hard to disentangle the relationship. Likewise, we could do with more evidence on what impact mental health loneliness actually has on outcomes of mental health, but to some extent, it's probably right to try and help people with it, even if the impact isn't that clear. Our network has ended up focusing a lot on social isolation, on loneliness rather than social isolation. but actually we should probably be considering both. Other questions that we could do with asking and answering are whether loneliness is actually the best word to use when we're trying to think about how to identify problems with people's social connections and trying to help people with those. Something that I think is really important is to do more of the kinds of qualitative work that Patrick and Bev presented, where you're trying to understand in more detail the pathways between loneliness and mental health and what kind of help people might actually want with loneliness. So what do we do? What do we know about what could work? Well, the short answer is not much. So if you try and look very rigorously at trials of what might help, there are not really trials where you could say, yes, that's really robust evidence that a specific type of intervention helps. There are some things that seem to work in the general population, so not necessarily people with mental health conditions. There are a variety of digital, psychological and social approaches that all seem to have some impact. And recently, people have sometimes linked together different kinds of approaches and interventions, which seems, if you can make it work, a really good idea, because we know that loneliness has complex psychological and social elements, so that if there's scope to address both of those, that could be really helpful. In thinking about the range of interventions that are possible, I'd suggest looking at a paper that Farhana Mann, who spoke to you earlier, has written, which goes through the different approaches that could be tried. So psychological interventions that try and change how people think about other people, these interesting social identity approaches where you try and think with people about how to develop more positive sense of belonging in particular valued groups. Peer support has particular promise when you think about the important effects of stigma and self-stigma on loneliness. There are various kinds of interventions that involve giving people support, things like community navigator interventions, although we know that just having more social contact doesn't on its own alleviate loneliness. The social contact needs to be valued and needs to actually result in a sense of connection. And an important thing to think about, I think, is that a lot of these interventions, a lot of these potential strategies individualize loneliness. So they locate loneliness in specific people, but actually lonely people are often experiencing multiple forms of disadvantage, and even more so when you look at lonely people who also have mental health conditions. There are a lot of basically external factors maintaining their loneliness, things like stigma they experience, structural forms of social deprivation. So we really should think whether actually the help with loneliness might not all come from focusing on an individual, but might come from focusing on communities and on society. Particular mention for the Community Navigator programme, which Bryn Lloyd-Evans will talk about this afternoon, which is a co-produced programme for trying to alleviate loneliness in people with severe depression and anxiety. It's currently subject of a big trial, and I think it's got about as far as any work in this area has down the sort of orthodox route of pilot study, big multi-centre trial, which is just about to start, excitingly. So why might this be hard, finally? I'll just take a couple of moments. One thing is that this is not like any area in which people have been used to trying to design strategies in mental health. pharmacological and psychological interventions basically can take place in clinic settings. They're fairly kind of confined. Loneliness interventions, inevitably to work, they're going to go way beyond standard mental health settings in their reach. It's likely that loneliness is a cluster of very varied experiences with complex links to mental health, and that different things cause its development and perpetuate it for different people. There are potential psychological and social and wider community approaches, and trying to think how to link those up and choose the best approaches for individuals are challenging. There has been, this is kind of going more into people's lives than mental health research often has done. And that's in many ways can be a good thing, because it may be getting at the essence of what people's problems are. But I think there are legitimate concerns all the same about intrusiveness and privacy, and we still need to learn how to really manage that delicately. And the area of sexual relationships, on which another big trial led by Liz Hughes is starting soon, is particularly an exemplar of that. It's likely that successful strategies for helping people need to be individualized to interests, existing social connections, people's skills, their social contexts. It's quite obviously, while when we look at this in a research context, we say there aren't strategies that have been shown clearly to help. Of course, that doesn't mean that no one is successfully helping any people with mental health problems with loneliness. There are loads of things going on out there in communities, in the voluntary sector, in the arts, loads of things that are likely to be helping people. We could do with more evidence, because evidence helps get things funded and it helps tailor the right strategies to the right people. But we also need to bear in mind the risk that we might harm some of the natural ways in which people try to help others with loneliness by trying to squeeze them into an orthodox research framework. And also we need to bear in mind throughout that the loneliest people are also often the most socially excluded and socially deprived. So I'm kind of constantly aware, really, in this field of work, of the danger of individualizing what are actually societal and structural problems. So sorry for going a minute or two over, but this last slide, I have the advantage of no chair for this session. You shouldn't have done that, Ellie. But just to say, just linking this to why we need the kind of research that you'll hear about in the Plus project sessions this afternoon and others. Why does research need to be drawing on lots of disciplines and co-produced with people with relevant lived experience? Really, we need that because of the complexity of this, because of the ways in which it goes well beyond clinical settings and clinical encounters with people, the range of ways in which, and I've pointed to just a few, in which you could take a wrong turn with this kind of research and potentially try and do things that are actively unhelpful. These are all reasons for having on board a wide range of disciplines and a wide range of people who bring relevant lived experience to this. And I hope some of these afternoon sessions will help people start thinking about the kinds of directions in which this sort of cross-disciplinary and participatory research could potentially go. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Essi Viding, who's here, I hope. Yes, she is. Hello, Essi, to chair some discussion about the things that have been said so far. Thank you.
Sonia, that was a real tour de force, and I think extremely sort of helpful in framing the discussion and very thoughtful. I'm Essi Viding, I'm professor in developmental psychopathology at UCL. I'm also a co-I on the network. And this morning we've heard some of the work the network has been doing in mapping the current evidence, and also Sonia's thoughts on what we currently know about loneliness or don't know about loneliness, social isolation and mental ill health. So in this short session, we've got a chance to identify what key research gaps remain to be answered. Sonia has already highlighted quite a few, but there may be others that people want to highlight. I am reliably informed that these can be sort of posted using the Mentimeter, which frankly I am not particularly familiar with myself, but Ellie I believe is managing, and I think there should be a link in the chat. There could also be an opportunity to ask questions in the old-fashioned way if anybody wants to do that. And I guess as we're waiting for these to come in, and I'm going to invite some of the speakers or Sonia to comment, I might want to just myself take a privilege of just prodding Sonia and asking, to what extent do you think we need to develop new methods, kind of new measurement that is richer and better about the sort of the social and systemic factors and how these relate to the individual factors? Because I think you quite rightly pointed out that the sort of the bidirectional associations are a challenge to study, and I wondered to what extent part of the challenge is that we don't at the moment have the best measures. And I think relatedly, if we want to study the interventions, do we need to think about new methods beyond the RCTs to do this well?
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of measures, I mean, we keep using these ancient measures from the last century. I mean, they do have the advantage that they have been used an awful lot and do have clear associations, the UCLA loneliness scale and the Young-Gierwelt scale. There is a very large body of literature that has used them. So that does mean that it's not completely obvious that it's the right thing to completely discard them. But I guess ideally, we would maybe use very short versions of the measures we use already, just because there is so much evidence that's used them, and then supplement those with much more kind of subtle, co-produced kind of measures that pick up the nature of people's loneliness or the nature of their lack of social connection. I'm still not 100% sure that loneliness is the right headline word for all this. So I think maybe extra measures rather than necessarily completely throwing out the ones we have. And likewise, I'd suggest that trials have just a value because of their currency in demonstrating that things should be funded, and I think there's value in doing them, but also a great deal of value in more mixed methods research, exploring people's experiences of different forms of help for loneliness. I'm just looking at the Mentimeter, which is coming up with loads of really interesting things. Yeah, some of them linked to measurement, in fact.
Yes, and I think one of the things that keeps cropping up, I don't know whether the themes sort of moved based on how they voted, but one of the things that sort of I noted, there was a comment that a lot of the loneliness research has been on the older adults, and clearly there is now a real concern among young people with lived experience that more work is needed there. So I'm wondering whether Ellie or Mary or Alexandra might want to comment on that at all, based on the work of the network.
Yeah, thanks, Essi. Yeah, I definitely think more work needs to be done in that area. And we do have 2 parallel sessions on young people coming up this afternoon. And I think that demonstrates that people are really starting to work in that demographic. But yeah, from the review that we did, there's just not enough trials to really know what's effective and what isn't at the moment. But I think the research is on its way, which is fantastic.
That's really brilliant. There's an interesting question from Sia Shah in the chat, who's asking whether Sonia, but I assume this works for anyone else who's given a talk as well, has a take on gap in our knowledge in relation to using artificial intelligence like social robotics to alleviate loneliness. Is this effective? Does it need to be a real human? Does that depend on who the person is?
We haven't got John Vines here, have we? No, I don't know. We have a digital partner in the loneliness network, and one of our
is real, but he does digital research.
Okay, yeah, but yes, indeed. So one of our postgraduate students, Gigi Lowe, has published a review. I'll try and post the link in the chat about digital approaches to trying to help people with mental health conditions with loneliness. And like many reviews in this area, she found quite a lot of things that seemed sort of feasible and acceptable, that people seem to participate in, and that things improved, but not sort of investigations of great rigor. And there are all sorts of things, actually, kind of assistive robots, online forums, apps. There's a whole lot of things encouraging meetup groups. There's a whole lot of things that it was suggested in the review might be investigated further, and that people did seem to engage with, at least to start with, but without there being really clear evidence, especially over a longer period.
So one of the Mentimeter suggestions that keeps cropping up is how to target lonely individuals in order to avoid stigma, and what would be sort of the best way to go about this. And I am wondering whether there is anyone of our lived experience co-Is who's here who might want to maybe comment on this, or anyone else for that matter. Or if no one is feeling brave enough, I don't know if Alexandra or you might want to, as a co-PI, say something about it. You gave some nice slides on the co-production aspects of the network. Is Alexandra here?
Yeah, hi, I'm here. I was tweeting. Can you just repeat the question, Essi?
Yeah, so there's a Mentimeter sort of suggestion as a gap that, you know, how we might target lonely individuals without stigmatizing, you know, how do you reach the people, for instance, who don't want to take part in co-production? Is there something alternative that can be done to have those people represented?
Yeah, well, Sharon Ego, who's here today, is doing some really interesting research at the moment, interviewing young people about what interventions would be acceptable to them in addressing loneliness. And this, you know, this is really interesting because it's in keeping with some of the other qualitative work we've done, in which young people say, you know, it's quite stigmatizing if there's a specific intervention for lonely young people. And we need to think more about universal interventions that we can deliver in schools or other educational settings, so that everybody is drawn into thinking about challenging their cognitions about their own thoughts about social isolation, thinking about other people who look isolated. And so therefore it becomes less stigmatizing and more acceptable. And Anna Hall's also done some very interesting research on this, and she's going to talk about that later today.
Great. I'm looking at the chat, and there's a very appropriate comment by Sudri Shah, who's saying that it's important to point out that some of the interventions may need to be adjusted to cope with particular requirements of ethnic minorities. And I think there is a sort of a comment that I think it nicely links into a comment by Nick Barber, who says that it would be interesting to explore the role of authenticity with regard to social connections. And I expect that this would be something where the authenticity has to do with being sort of culturally sensitive as well. So I wonder whether any of the speakers has any comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's definitely seems to be about meaningful connection. But I think the work that Bev and Patrick were talking about really shows that what people want to feel connected to can really differ between different individuals. And that may be due to cultural conditioning, it might be to other factors, but you know, it's not just one size fits all, as I think we all know from loneliness intervention work. But yeah, who people want to be connected to. So that might be nature, it might be spirituality or religion, it might be a pet, but that can really differ. Yeah.
I think so. Sexual minorities are also a really important group, aren't they? With LGBTQ plus groups where loneliness is high, and I'm sure one needs to think carefully about what's most helpful in tailoring interventions to them.
Right. There is also, a theme that keeps cropping up at the top, which is there isn't sort of sufficient work looking at social isolation and loneliness and as discrete identities. And Sonia, you mentioned that a little bit at the end of your talk, and I'm wondering whether you think there is sort of there's sort of an obvious low-hanging fruit that we should be going after there or not.
Yeah, it's interesting because the research used to be only on social networks and not on loneliness until about 10 years ago. There was very little research on loneliness and mental health, and now there's a relatively large amount, and people don't so much look at social networks. I mean, I think the kind of subjective nature of loneliness makes it potentially the more obvious focus in terms, because it is about how people actually feel about their social connections, whereas interpreting the sort of what it means to have 5 people you know or something is quite hard, isn't it? It might be very different for different people. But having said that, I think, yeah, it shouldn't be forgotten, and it might well turn out to have different effects. And there's probably potential in some cases for using the same data sets actually to also examine effects of social network size or being completely socially isolated. The two are associated, but not that closely associated, actually.
Yes, I note in the Mentimeter that there's a plea that just because much of the work has been done in the older people, that we don't now think that work is done. That work is done and dusted, and I don't think anybody would, I hope, in this meeting. So I think that's a really important point. Other things that I've raised in the Mentimeter is the importance of looking at childhood experiences such as bullying in relation to loneliness, and I think here the sort of the bi-directional relationships between vulnerabilities and experiences and the loneliness over time is going to be really kind of important to look at, and this relates to another point that has been raised in the Mentimeter, which is that we need more longitudinal data on chains, or I suppose also stability in the experience of loneliness and social isolation. Another thing that keeps cropping up in the Mentimeter is domestic abuse and loneliness, where I assume we need a lot more work. Then there is John the real John digitally has put a message in the chat where he says that there's significant amount of technology-oriented interventions focusing on older adults. And there's been R&D investment in that space, but perhaps less so for children and adolescents. I think we are coming to the end of the allocated time for this session. So I think we've managed to hopefully have a relatively balanced set of responses to the Mentimeter suggestions, and also questions and comments from the chat. So I'm going to finish the session by thanking all the speakers, and I'm now going to hand over to Ellie for the next bit in the procedures.
Brilliant, thanks Essi. So we're going into a break now until 12, but I just wanted to give you a heads up that after the break we'll be going into breakout rooms for the parallel sessions. So during the break, if you want to have a look at the programme and choose which parallel session you want to go in, that would be great. And what we'll do is when we come back, I'll open the breakout rooms a couple of minutes early for the speakers and chairs to go in. But in order to choose the breakout room, you just need to find the icon for breakout rooms, and it's usually at the bottom of your screen. When you press that, you'll be able to choose which breakout room you want to go into. You're welcome to try and swap between breakout rooms for different talks, but because the time is quite tight, I can't guarantee that you won't miss a bit of the next talk if you try and do that. And throughout the breakout rooms, I'm going to be in the main session. So if you get stuck, just come back to the main meeting and I'll be there to help you. So yeah, we've got a break now until 12. So look forward to seeing you then for the parallel sessions. Thank you. And thanks to everyone so far. Yeah, really enjoying it so far. So I hope you are too. Thank you.
Hello everybody and welcome back from lunch. I hope you had a nice break. My name is Rosie Perkins. I'm Professor of Music, Health and Social Science at the Royal College of Music and an Honorary Senior Research Fellow in the Faculty of Medicine at Imperial. So welcome to this panel discussion on how to integrate psychological and social approaches to addressing loneliness and social isolation in the context of mental health. The session is co-convened with the BASIL study and the Closing the Gap network, which is one of the other UKRI funded mental health networks. Unfortunately, the principal investigator of BASIL and Closing the Gap, Simon Gilbody, isn't able to join us today, but we're really delighted that his colleague, Leanne, is here on his behalf. So the way this will work is that I will ask each of our speakers, we have 5 speakers, a question. They will have 5 minutes to provide a response, and then we will open this up to discussion. So please do think of your questions and comments and pop those into the chat during the discussion period at the end of this session. So without any further ado, we will get into the questions. And our first contributor is Professor Roz Shafran. Roz is a co-investigator on the network and is Professor of Translational Psychology at the UCL Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health. So Roz, your question is, are cognitive behavioural therapy-based interventions the answer? How could social elements be integrated into psychological, e.g. CBT, interventions?
Thank you very much. And thank you for what a wonderful morning and presentations that we've had. So I'm just as a bit of a disclaimer as to why I'm here. So I am a card-carrying CBT therapist, and I've been a member of the CBT Association for decades. And when in my previous job, I was appointed a professor of CBT, and I actually asked to change it to professor of evidence-based psychological treatment, because for me, what's important is what works. It's the evidence, as opposed to a rigid sticking to a specific modality. And I think, I don't want to sound like a politician, but is CBT the answer? It kind of depends on the question. But also just about, I think what I can contribute, I could not sit here and say CBT is the answer. That's all, because we've heard this morning, we've seen the data. It can't be the answer. There's a huge heterogeneity, diversity in needs and experiences. So I think for me, an approach that really focuses on the individual and is evidence-based is the answer. So then, if we think about what is evidence-based practice has these 3 components. It isn't just the research evidence, which is abundantly clear that you need to have. It cannot simply be a CBT intervention and that's the cure-all for all. It can be part of it, but it can't be standalone. So I think there's the research evidence. You've got the clinical experience. which is actually you need to personalize interventions that no two people are the same, and how do you do that without trying to develop a plethora of interventions that don't have a common stream. And also the third sort of angle to evidence-based treatment in terms of it being really taking into account patient preferences and values. So I would say for me that good CBT is principle led. It's not rigid, and it's not I'm on session 1 and I need to do that, and it's not I'm in the office and I can't go outside the office. It's understanding what's in front of the person that's in front of you, understanding how their loneliness developed, understanding what's keeping their loneliness going, which is a key aspect of CBT, is sort of the what's keeping it going in the here and now. And if some of those factors are social, then you want to address those factors. But you also want to keep track, because I think Bryn, when we got this question, Bryn's question is almost the direct opposite. So I wanted to make sure we weren't going to give an inconsistent message, but in fact we're not, because there's something about not trying to do everything. We cannot develop interventions that are not going to be used in the NHS. And there's a lot of information coming out that actually being focused on doing one thing well is really a value on lots of different problems all at the same time. So I think having a CBT approach that is data driven for some people will be the answer, but it absolutely won't be the answer for others. And we need better ways of finding out for whom it can contribute and make a difference, and for whom it's less likely to. Is that my 5 minutes?
You're on 3 minutes.
Oh, okay, so I can talk some more.
You can
okay.
if you would like. Would you like to, or do you want to hand over, Roz?
I just want to say one more thing then. If gosh, I can't see a clock on my screen, which is about some of the innovations in CBT are really relevant here. So one of the innovations I think is about doing modularity. So the idea that you can have a suite of interventions, and that potentially you work together to work out what is the best intervention for that person. So things like social skills training, people with autism and social skills deficits are going to really benefit from that. An older adult who has been bereaved and doesn't have social skills deficits is not going to want to have that at all. So it has to be able to still be within a framework, because the idea that the therapist just pick and mixes and doesn't have any framework also has a long-standing literature that's not the best approach either. So it's this sort of idea that of being data-driven, guided, but having all these 3 components, I think, that really help. But along with the principle, which I'm going to steal your thunder, Bryn, about that it's a principle of parsimony. So if you can do simpler interventions first, then why go overcomplicated? And I think as long as you're keeping track and having that flexibility, then I think you are doing CBT in principle. You also taking advantage of the wider literature and understanding what's going on for an individual at that particular point in their lives.
Thank you so much, Roz. Already a lot of food for thought for us. So we will move now to our second contributor, Leanne Shearsmith. Leanne is a research assistant in the School of Medicine at the University of Leeds and a collaborator on the Basel study. Leanne, your question: can the Basel study tell us about how best to integrate psychological and social approaches to address social isolation and loneliness in older adults?
Thank you, Rosie. So the short answer is yes, I believe it can. First, just to give some context behind the Basel study, it was a pilot randomized controlled trial addressing loneliness and social isolation in older adults during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's now a main definitive RCT. It's led by Simon Gilbody and David Eakers at the University of York, and it was one of only 2 mental health studies to receive urgent public health status in the UK during the pandemic. And this is because we know that loneliness and the associated onset of depression is already a big problem amongst older adults. COVID just magnified the problems that older people were already dealing with. So as part of a study called MODS, we had already been co-producing a bespoke intervention for loneliness and depression when the pandemic hit. So we adapted it for remote delivery, trained up support workers who were a wide range of healthcare professionals, research staff, Age UK workers, and recruited from June to October 2020. The intervention is based on behavioural activation. It's based on a behavioural theory of depression. It's essentially the B in CBT, and it works by focusing on maintaining people's daily routines, because we know that what people do influences how they feel, and people's daily routines were very much disrupted in the pandemic, and there was that kind of danger that they move into levels of inactivity and they lose those kind of positive reinforcing aspects of daily activities. So older adults were given a work booklet and offered up to 8 telephone calls with a support worker that we trained to help them work through the booklet and tackle that loss of routine. And linking back to the psychological approach to addressing social isolation and loneliness in older adults, we've got behavioural activation as a framework for connecting with behaviours that provide reward and value in their environment, and for teaching people about that link between mood and behaviour. But it's important to remember the backdrop of social exclusion and social isolation in which this brief psychological therapy was delivered. Our older adult population had been told by the government to stay at home and avoid all face-to-face contact with people outside the household. Initially, this was for 12 weeks in March 2020, but we'll all remember it ended up being around 9 months on and off. And for many older adults, this kind of social isolation as an impact of shielding was still very much their way of life. It hasn't kind of gone away. So in our qualitative findings, we're seeing that the telephone contact with the support worker was a very valued form of social contact, something that they really valued about the intervention. And we're finding that having one-to-one sessions with a trained basal support worker as a kind of objective third party that they could slowly open up to about their problems actually encouraged them to start opening up to their own partners or family members about their feelings of loneliness and low mood, because older adults often find it really difficult to talk about mental health openly. So inevitably the social approach is wrapped up within kind of the psychological approach. And I think behavioural activation as a tool is really key to integrating those two approaches, because it provides a framework for older adults to look at the issues that they have, think about that link between mood and behaviour, and facilitate social interactions with others. We've heard today about the importance of helping older adults overcome social confidence issues, and I think we definitely found that within the Basel study through the framework of behavioural activation and collaborative care. Basel support workers were supporting and encouraging older adults to reach out to their friends, reach out to their GPs at a time when people thought GPs wouldn't want to know, to join community groups, amongst other things. So I think that the Basel study tells us that the psychological and social approaches can be very successfully integrated when a framework or tool such as behavioural activation is delivered via a support worker. And our kind of early findings from the pilot trial show quite a strong signal of effect in reducing loneliness, and we're just in the process of collecting that 12-month follow-up data from the Basel main trial now. So watch this space.
Thank you, Leanne, and we definitely will watch that space. It'll be fascinating to see those results. So we're going to move now to our next contributor, Lorna Hogg. Lorna is Deputy Director, Clinical and Professional of the Oxford Institute of Clinical Psychology Training, and is doing her PhD on social identity interventions for people with psychosis. Lorna, your question. What can we learn from the Groups for Health approach about combining psychological and social approaches to address loneliness and mental ill health?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. So just to start by saying a little bit about Groups for Health, because I suspect not everybody's familiar with this programme. So it's a 5-session evidence-based group programme, which takes place over the course of 2 months. So there's 4 weekly spaced sessions and then a further session, follow-up session after a month. And the aim of the programme is really to support people to develop the knowledge and skills that they need to join new social groups and to sustain those social group memberships in the longer term. Excuse me. So I'd like to make three kind of key points, really. One is not dissimilar to the last speaker. I think Groups for Health also is quite a nice example of a programme in which we can nicely integrate psychological and social elements to address loneliness. So although it's primarily considered to be a social intervention, I'll come back to talk a little bit more about why. It also does weave quite nicely psychological interventions through the kind of group sessions, according to kind of group members' needs. So it incorporates things like reviewing past social experiences, thinking about what we can learn from these, setting goals, problem solving, challenging those kind of unhelpful beliefs that might underpin loneliness, like other people might be rejecting, I might not have the skills to be able to relate to other people, etc. So it doesn't do these in the kind of usual sort of individualized CBT way, but they are nevertheless kind of important elements that are woven through the programme. The second point I'd like to make is that, and it's the kind of key point I think, is that the main focus for Groups for Health is the group itself. So the group is essentially a psychological resource in and of itself and acts as a vehicle for change. So the notion is that actually it's the connections that people form in the group through relating to other people who've got similar challenges, who've been through similar experiences, who can show that sort of empathy, that validation, that kind of acceptance, lack of judgment that people need in this respect. And it's through that kind of process of identifying with others, connecting with others, that kind of fosters self-esteem and kind of impacts people's sense of self in a positive way, but also provides a platform for the giving and receiving of social support. And also enables people to think about how they can then progress beyond the group to kind of extend those kind of social connections into their local community. So the group is a really important kind of vehicle for change and enables bringing about psychological change. The third point, kind of building on that really, that I'd like to make is that, you know, I think there are different ways to achieve the same end. And in cognitive therapy, I'm a card-carrying cognitive therapist. But I think often what we're seeking to do is to try to change the way that people make sense of things, and therefore change the way they feel about them, the way they can act in situations. And I think there's lots of different ways to do that. I totally echo Roz's point about, you know, this needs to be individualized, and modularized also seems excellent to me. One of the things that I think Groups for Health does is it provides kind of corrective social experiences. So people have the opportunity within the group to have the experience of actually being able to relate to other people, to be understood, to be accepted. And I think that's fundamentally important. I'd like to mention some, I think, really interesting work by Tegan Crewis and colleagues published in 2014, which was a couple of longitudinal studies. And it was basically looking at the effects of developing new social group ties on social isolation schemas. So these are kind of firmly held, quite inflexible beliefs that people have, like I'll always be on the outside of groups, I'll never be accepted, that kind of thing. Often emanate from early experience, sometimes abusive, neglectful experiences, quite hard to shift. Traditionally, we tend to think about lengthy individual CBT. So in these two longitudinal studies, one was with homeless population and one was with adults with anxiety and depressive difficulties. And although they didn't target schemas in the intervention, what they were able to show was that actually developing new social ties to a social group was enough to bring about significant change in those schemas. So relatively short-term intervention, but actually it was quite impactful. So I think, you know, even a kind of social approach can actually have quite important psychological impacts. So I think it's really complex, and I think we need to think about how different approaches work together, and of course what's effective and what works for whom. I think that's also crucially important. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lorna. I think we're going to have a really rich discussion following these 5-minute contributions. Let's move to the next contributor, Dr. Bryn Lloyd-Evans. Bryn is another co-investigator on the network and associate professor in the Division of Psychiatry at UCL and deputy director of the NIHR Mental Health Policy Research Unit. Bryn, when might it not be a good idea to integrate social and psychological approaches for loneliness in mental health populations?
Thanks very much, Rosie. Hi, and it's great to see everyone today and hear all the talks. So I'm a card-carrying social worker, and I'm also part of a team that's doing a trial of the Community Navigators program, which is a purely socially approach to trying to help with loneliness for people with mental health problems. And so I'm obviously hopeful that that will prove to be effective, even though it doesn't include any integrated psychological components. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm not disinterested, and I'm slightly sort of set up as the contrarian in this debate. But I think I've got a lot of common ground with everyone, in fact. And I think kind of what Roz was saying is really true about trying to find that balance between giving people options and having individualized approaches that meet people's needs versus having programs that are manageable and deliverable and aren't trying to do everything for everyone is key. We should acknowledge, I think, that there are sort of surprisingly few trials of interventions for loneliness with populations of people with severe mental health problems, especially people using mental health services currently. And we don't have sort of strong evidence at the moment about what approaches work best. I think we need to be a bit careful reading across from studies in the general population or primary care and assuming what works for those groups are necessarily going to work for people with severe mental health problems for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think what other care people are getting and have had might make a difference to how interventions are received. So for instance, how much psychological care people have had previously, and also perhaps the low level of sort of challenges with making social connections and the level of social exclusion that people are experiencing might make things difficult. So we're thinking in the Community Navigators study, which is in people who have used secondary care for quite a long time, that actually some social support to help with kind of the challenges of finding and accessing welcoming and accessible and affordable social groups and interventions might be really helpful. I think where should we start with kind of developing and testing programs? We clearly need more evidence. I would be a bit concerned if we start with developing the most complex program we can that's integrating lots of components of psychological and social support for two reasons. I think, first of all, kind of even if a trial was done and it proves to be effective, we might be left with an intervention where A, we're not sure kind of quite what the critical ingredients are and are all those components needed. And B, we have something which is quite expensive and potentially quite difficult to implement at scale if you have to recruit, either have different staff members providing different bits or recruit and train people really very carefully. It might be a better bet to start with testing simpler social interventions and psychological interventions and see where that leaves us. And if either both or one of those proves very effective on its own, we might have our answers without needing to something more integrated and complex. Just a couple of other quick thoughts to throw in. I think if we look across at other areas of mental health care, that suggests to us that where effective social interventions have been developed, there's no guarantee that a clinical augmentation is going to improve them. And one really good example of that that's been trialled quite a lot is supported employment. So IPS is a model that is a very evidence-based for helping people find work. And numerous kind of psychological additions have been tacked onto that in trials to see whether it improves its cognitive remediation, CBT, social skills training. And generally they've had limited, if any, effect. Really, the results have been very disappointing there. So adding a psychological component to a social intervention is not a given that it's going to improve it. And lastly, I think I'd like to echo the point that Lorna made, and I think I've said in sort of previous talks in this network, that yes, there's obviously a big cognitive element to loneliness, and helping people to change the way they think about themselves and their place in their social world and other people is really important. But that's not necessarily that sort of formalized psychological therapy is the only way to achieve that goal, really. And one of the promising findings from our Community Navigators feasibility trial was the feedback from participants in qualitative interviews, where at least some of them were reporting quite profound changes in how they thought about themselves and their world. So reclaiming lost but valued social identities, or being more willing to give other people a chance and feeling less social threat from others. So I think we're hopeful we might help people to achieve that cognitive change through our sort of social approach. So just to conclude, where are we now? I think we're all theorizing. We clearly need more evidence to inform what we're talking about. But I guess my reservation would be that I'm not convinced that starting with the kind of most complex integrated multi-component intervention is the way to go, and that may yet turn out not to be something that we need.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Bryn. And we're going to come to our final contributor now, Anjie Chhapia, member of the network's co-production group. Anjie, do you think there's a place for both social and psychological approaches in addressing loneliness, social isolation and mental ill health? And if so, how could we best support people to choose the right kind of help for them?
Thank you for that introduction. I just wanted to share that I am a lived experience research participant in this study as well. And I was part of the Community Navigator program when it was happening with UCL. What I wanted to share with my lived experience is that, yes, what Roz said, I really support that statement of being very person-centered approach. It has to be individualized, it has to be tailor-made. That's what worked for me. Starting with psychological therapies didn't work with me. It was very much first connection with me and the person that was believing in me that worked for me. And that was the initial point where my journey started with the recovery. It wasn't just the psychological aspect of connections. So for me, I think it's quite powerful to say that social identity, social connections, social community links worked for me very well. No, I'm not saying that it will work for everybody, but I think one has to be open to that choice. I think people should have that choice, and a person-centered approach is something I would always favor because that's what's powerful. And the other thing I would like to say is what worked for me is the tailor-made approach, that one day I wasn't that well, but one day I was okay. So to be able to fit into that, to be able to see that from my point of view, rather than the intervention point of view. So the end outcome was me, not the outcome that the person was looking for. So that worked for me very well, I would say. And I think the fact that my cultural and diverse needs were taken into account was very important to me, that I was linked with my community, with what my needs were spirituality-wise, cultural-wise, and community-wise. That when that was given a focus, I was able to get my identity back. So I was able to be more empowered. And I think empowering the person was very important for me. And I think it works for people because that's the starting journey for them. Anything else that comes psychologically or mental health support is actually was secondary in my mind. The first things were more important to me to become a whole person first. So I think the whole person-centered approach was something that I favored. But again, I would sort of emphasize what Roz said, is to work together to make sure that it's, it's open. You are open in your approach so that the person doesn't feel that you are just giving them something. It's being able to fit into what they need. So again, I would emphasize that. Empowerment was something that I found really a nugget. It was like a starting point for me again. When I look back into 2000, when I was completely down, what supported my recovery and what supported my betterment was the empowerment that I received by recognizing what my skills were before and trying to focus on those and bringing them back to giving me the opportunity to link into those type of things. So that worked for me quite well. So I think social and psychological together would work wonders. Yes, I would always support that, but it doesn't mean that one has to be before the other, but needs to be working together. If one has to be dropped, then you have to drop it. If the other has to be dropped, you have to drop it, but you have to go with the person's needs. That's what worked for me. What I'd say for the kind of help, I think again, it should be person-centered. And in that, I would like to also say that what was empowering for me is the triangle of care, is to also believe in the carer, to make sure that the carer's views are also taken into account. Because sometimes a person who is suffering loneliness or suffering from mental health issues cannot actually verbalize what they need. So keeping in mind that even sometimes carers' views need to be taken into account so that you can give the appropriate choices to that person so that the person doesn't lose out. Because sometimes the focus is so much on the patient. And if the patient cannot verbalize the needs, then the intervention is actually not very fruitful, or you won't get the outcome that you need. So we need to consider that sometimes, and especially in terms of people with language barriers. Carers do come into quite an effective position because they would know more and how to sort of verbalize the needs of the person who needs the care. So yeah, so I would just repeat myself into saying that choice and empowerment, person-centered approach, and individual approach is something that I would sort of advocate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anjie. That wraps up these contributions so nicely. Thank you to all of the panelists so far, and we're now going to open this up to discussion. So if you have questions or would like to make comments, please pop them in the chat or pop up your virtual hand. I can't see everyone, but hopefully you will come to the top of my screen if you do put up your virtual hand. Would anyone like to kick off the discussion? Alexandra, I do have a question, but do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, go for it, Rosie.
One of the things that seemed to stretch across the contributions was that we need more evidence. We heard this several times, we need more evidence. So what are the panel's views on where we start with this from here? Where do we go next in terms of building that evidence? And there have been various different perspectives offered in terms of keeping it simple, but also trying to make sure we embed flexibility, personalised care and so on. So what do the panel feel we should do next to get the evidence that we need? Bryn.
And I think there are a couple of ways of going about it, and one is obviously trials provide the best form of evidence, and if we can get funding for trials of really kind of clearly defined and theoretically based interventions, so we know what it is we're testing, ideally with a good process evaluation alongside, so we can really see what people have got and what potential some of the mechanisms are, that would be really helpful. Another possible approach is to try and make use of kind of existing data, and Dora Stefanida, who you're going to hear from this afternoon, is about to start a PhD, which will look at kind of embedding a measure of loneliness in IAPT data and looking at how much kind of primary care psychological therapy makes an impact on loneliness for people and how far loneliness moderates the effects of therapy there, which I think is also a sort of terrific and quite efficient way of trying to understand how much some of the things that we've already got and provide may help with loneliness and for whom.
Yeah, thank you. Did anyone else want to jump in on that?
The only thing I'd like to add, I completely agree with Bryn, is this idea of practice-based evidence, so that actually people, clinicians all the time are trying different things, and it's a potential source of really what happens across different settings with different populations. So if we can capture that with data and pool that, it's actually pretty low-hanging fruit. If just people could just enter it anonymously into a database and some key variables, I think we would then be able to get a really good national picture of what's happening on the ground, that would feed into the larger data sets, the studies that Bryn's talking about, and the very expensive trials as well.
Thank you very much.
I think one of the problems with the field, though, is that if you look at the existing evidence, people are looking at different things. So, for example, in terms of looking at loneliness or well-being, so it relates to some of the discussion this morning. So I think that's a bit problematic. So I think it would be helpful if we could think about measures, but also think about, what are the kind of key variables that we want to evaluate in terms of outcome that would really help us to kind of translate across different studies. But it's difficult.
Beverly, I saw your hand pop up.
Hi. Certainly, informally in the meetings I go to where there's GPs and clinicians, there's an awful lot of wisdom. And I think historically much of this isn't captured in the patient record because of the way that things are coded. You might get some more qualitative information in the notes, but that's been fairly inaccessible until quite recently. But now there's great strides ahead with machine learning and being able to analyze free text data. I think it's still got a long way to go in terms of sophistication and the nuances of when something's mentioned, if that's a positive or a negative. But I think that maybe if we're looking at some technology and digital advances to progress in this field, that might be a source of data that hasn't been explored yet, just because we couldn't do it before.
Yeah, very important. Lorna, there's actually a question for you in the chat from Ellie. Ellie, are you happy for me to read it, or would you like to say it yourself?
I can say it, yeah. This might be letting the cat out of the bag, Lorna, so sorry if it is, but I was just wondering, so I know you're working with groups for health and people with psychosis, and I just wondered, has it been appropriate? Do you have enough data to say whether it works with people with psychosis, or that they like it, or anything about that?
Well, the simple answer is no, because of the pandemic, I've had to delay the start of the trials. So I've literally just accepted my first 2 participants into the trials. So I'll have to talk to you in a year or so's time to be able to properly answer that question. But when I have worked with people with psychosis for the last kind of 35 years or so, and often providing groups, all sorts of different groups. And I think sometimes there is a bit of a sense that people with those kind of severe mental health difficulties may find it quite difficult to be in a group, or not want to be in a group with other people with those kind of similar challenges. That's not been my experience. I think sometimes people need a little bit of help to get over the kind of threshold. And I think having a connection with one other person, so joining the group so that you're not joining on your own, can be helpful. But I think often when people get into the group itself, they very quickly appreciate the kind of positives of connecting with other people who've been through a similar experience. And it's that kind of sense of being understood, not judged, accepted for who they are, that is tremendously powerful. So yeah, I look forward to seeing whether people engage with it, keep my fingers crossed, but I'm confident, and I think there's lots of reason to feel that it should be just as successful with people with psychotic difficulties as not. I think it needs to be adapted. So I think we need to think about the kind of more specific things like, kind of impacts of medication, etc., and how kind of narratives around psychosis might actually come to bear, in terms of stigma, dangerousness, etc. Plus also kind of people's unusual perceptual experiences, beliefs about being at risk of being harmed by others, these kinds of things might need to be picked up within the context of the group. So I think it needs some adaptation, but I'm excited to see whether it works. I think it's worth a try. Thank you.
A lot of what you say there really resonates with what we find in the intervention work that we do with the arts. And we see that this space where people can come together and they don't necessarily need to explain an experience, but they know that people in that space have had a similar experience, can be really powerful and supportive. And my ears sort of pricked up in the various contributions that touched on the sort of verbal, non-verbal, and the fact that sometimes verbally expressing something isn't necessarily easy or straightforward. So I wonder how the panel feel, and of course I'm biased coming from the arts, but how the panel feel about the integration of approaches such as music, where there may be no need for verbalization, into these sorts of psychological and social interventions, and where those sorts of approaches might or might not be appropriate. I stunned everyone into silence. Roz.
I'll give it a go. I just think there is so much siloing of things. There's, even you can be a researcher and someone with lived experience. You can do individual and you can do group. You can do, one of the comments for me was about emotional and social loneliness. You can accept that there are differences and different things will be different to people, but there is an awful lot of overlap. So, I mean, I would think that most of patients who do CBT probably put their headphones on the way out and listen to some music, and so I think Bryn and I are on the same page in terms of not overcomplicating things, not saying, oh, well, let's add music to CBT and then actually let's do a groups for health thing because they all seem to work. So there does need to be a framework in which it can be disseminated, it can be utilised within the NHS, that it can be personalised and it's not overwhelming so that you actually just don't know where to start. But I think there's no reason that in principle we shouldn't be trying to look and saying, okay, within the sort of principles that we want to do, why couldn't you offer somebody a CBT approach if that's what they is part of their preference, but also some of the music and poetry and expressing yourself and expressive writing, which is very much part of CBT and distancing. So, I mean, I was struck when I went to, years ago, I went to a seminar on something, a really, really different therapy. And I spent the whole time trying to say, well, actually, I think that's CBT. I think that's, that actually there's so much commonality. And if we can just sort of harness that and work together as opposed to different people trying to protect their own territories, I think that would be in everybody's best interest.
Thank you. Are there other perspectives on that? Yeah, Beverly.
I've done art therapy with a few different people, both privately and on the NHS. And one of the things that has surprised me is how things can come out that I wasn't necessarily conscious of. So it's therapeutic for me anyway, just to be doing art and to be with a group of people and maybe not having to speak so much. But I'll paint something and then I can look at it a couple of days later and I see something else. It's almost like, there's what you paint and then there's the metaphor and the meaning that underpins that. And that has been a really important tool in helping me understand myself. And I think for people that have experiences that are difficult to speak about, past traumas, or if there's cultural sensitivity around mental ill health or certain taboos, art can be a really powerful way to communicate and express that. I'm thinking, back to Edward Adamson and, those pioneering art therapy groups that he set up and just how much those images from those inpatients conveyed things that it would be difficult to put into words and really encapsulate the emotion behind it. So I think it certainly should be part of the offer, and it can maybe be a key to some of the people that find it more difficult to engage in verbal or relational therapies.
Yeah, thank you. And it comes back to the modularity that you were talking about at the beginning, Roz, this idea of, a suite of options that we can personalize and that people can personalize for themselves. So we're drawing towards the end of our time now. Is there anyone else who would like to pop a question to the panel or to provide a closing comment? I don't see any, oh, Alexandra.
I suppose thinking about trial design, this talk about very personalised approaches makes me think, oh my goodness, how hard it must be to design a trial where you have to, you know, consider all these different personalised approaches. Any tips from the trialists here?
I don't think it's difficult. So I don't think I don't think there's a difficulty in having a 10-session intervention that's all the same versus a 10-session intervention from a suite where somebody gets to choose. So I think the key principle is about it being data-driven, and that actually you do need to evaluate as you go. You do need some sort of framework and algorithms, which is where this interesting conversation about AI also fits in to do it. But I don't think it's inherently any different from any other trial design.
Thanks.
Bryn, I think you'll have the final word.
Oh gosh, that's pressure. Yeah, I suppose there are just, I think modular approaches are really attractive, aren't there? But there are two ways of trying to go about that, really. Either you build up your evidence base and then provide a modular options of programs you know have some evidence of effectiveness already, or you provide a lot of things you hope are going to be helpful, and then you try and unpick what works for whom and which of those seem to be adding value later, which can take an awful long time and be hard to do robustly, but allows you perhaps to do what you want to do earlier. So that's the dilemma, I think, with modular approaches. That's not a very helpful last word, is it, to end on with a question, but best I can do.
I think we can see a whole load of potential here with all of the ideas that we've been discussing and the right people in the room to take this forwards. So thank you again to all of the panelists and everyone who's contributed to the discussion. And I think I will pass back now to Ellie.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Rosie. Thanks for your chairing. And yeah, echoing, thank you very much to all the panelists. I feel like we could continue that discussion for a lot longer, but it's now time for a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 2:40 for the second set of parallel sessions. And as before, you will be able to choose which breakout room to go into. We'll post the the programme has just been posted in the chat, thank you Millie, so you can have a look at what's available. I will open the breakout rooms now, so you've got plenty of time to get yourself into the right one, but it is a 10-minute break and we'll start again at 2:40. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ellie. So yeah, I think we'll get started now, if that's okay, to keep us on track still. For those of you that haven't met me, my name's John Vines. I'm a professor at the University of Edinburgh, where I work in the Institute for Design Informatics. And I'm also one of the many co-investigators on the Loneliness and Social Isolation in Mental Health Network. And as a designer, I get very excited about futures and what we might head towards. So I'm really pleased to be chairing this second panel discussion that we have today, which is titled Next Steps for Addressing Loneliness, Social Isolation in the Context of Mental Health. So the format is very similar to the panel that we had earlier this afternoon. We have 5 speakers. Each speaker will have about 5 minutes to respond to a question that we have posed to them in advance. So they've had a bit of preparation to do. As our panelists are speaking, as we've done throughout today, please do post any questions, comments, or reflections that you have in the Zoom chat. We'll try to keep track of those. Some of the panelists might respond to you in the chat, and we'll try and bring them out for the Q&A and discussion that we'll have after each of the panelists have spoken. So on that note, though, we'll get started with our first speakers. And I believe we're going to start with a duet or a conversation of some sorts to begin with Pamela Qualter and Ravneet Virdi. Pam is Professor of Education at the University of Manchester, and Rav leads the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sports, Tackling Loneliness team. And I believe you've combined your 5 minutes together. So I've said you've got 10 minutes, but you might be shorter, but somewhere within that. And the question that we've posed to you is, what are the key next steps for research and policy in addressing loneliness and social isolation in the context of mental health? Pam, so hand over to you first.
Yeah, I don't mind going first. So it's worth us pointing out that there's an evidence group that works with DCMS, and there are several people in the network that are actually members of that group. And we were asked by DCMS to look at the evidence within the field of loneliness and highlight the key gaps. So there were several of us that came together with the idea of each of us taking a particular area and then really, well, locating that evidence first of all for people, because it's a massive area, isn't it now? The loneliness field has really expanded significantly. And it's becoming increasingly difficult, I think, for non-specialists. So not just policymakers, but also people in the voluntary sector, third sector funders, research funders. It's becoming really difficult for them to be able to understand all of that literature. And I think for people who haven't got a lot of time, being able to digest the evidence is quite difficult. And I think sometimes it means that they're not necessarily looking at rigor. Instead, it's a case of going based on impact factor or author reputation and so on. But what we were able to do in our small teams for the evidence review was to really get up-to-date research that was evaluated by people in the field. So we came up with a whole list of evidence gaps, and then Ravneet's team has been able to use that information to really direct future funding. So shall I hand over now to you, Rav?
Great, thanks, Pam. Yeah, so as Pam said, the evidence gaps report was produced by the evidence group of stakeholders that we convene. And just to set this in context, hopefully you'll be aware, but in 2018, the government published a Tackling Loneliness strategy, and building the evidence base was one of the three, sorry if you can hear sirens in the background, but building the evidence base was one of the three kind of guiding strategic objectives for our work, and it continues to be. So that point of Pam's around making evidence accessible to people who need that information to kind of make the case for their own work is really vital to what we do. So the kind of work of the evidence group is really helpful to us, yes, in producing the evidence gaps report, but also as a kind of a forum for us to discuss what everyone's planning, what we've got on the horizon, what we're becoming aware of, so that we're not duplicating efforts and we can kind of be as coordinated as possible. And on the evidence gaps report, it's obviously very useful to us as government and hopefully to stakeholders, you know, domestically. But as a country, we're world leading in this area, and we've already had international stakeholders say that the evidence gap is really useful for their work as well. Sorry. We have various events happening. This is the danger of being in the office in Whitehall. You may have seen there was some Extinction Rebellion protests, so there's a lot of activity going on, so I'm really sorry. I'm just going to have to pause for 1 minute. And Pam, I don't know if maybe you want to fill for a second.
Yeah, I can fill as well. I mean, the thing I think that's great about the evidence gap is, yes, it helps the DCMS team, but like Rav says, it's already helping people in other countries put forward arguments for particular types of funding. And it's also great for us as researchers, because we've clearly highlighted what those gaps are. And already what we've seen today is that people are filling those gaps. So we're able to move forward, actually, I think, a lot quicker than perhaps we would have been able to. Are you able to take over again, Rav? Yeah?
That was perfectly timed, thank you. And off the back of the gaps report, we've already commissioned some evidence to help start filling some of those gaps. We commissioned NatSen, and I think the link has just been shared, to produce 2 reports for us. The first is a qual study looking at the links between loneliness and mental health. And the second is a quantitative study using data sets existing to look at factors affecting loneliness for different population types, different demographics over the life course as well. And I'll go through just a few of the kind of key findings, just because time's limited, but you'll be able to see more at those links. But in terms of some of the evidence gaps that we've started to fill, specifically through the loneliness and mental health work. So the first key finding is around the gap on the bidirectional relationship between loneliness and mental health. And the research provides both qual and quant findings that there is that bidirectional and cyclical relationship. On the second point, that kind of relationship between loneliness and mental health, it brings a lot of kind of colour around the impact of stigma on the relationship between those two. And specifically, the research shows that people don't want to be perceived as a loner or a downer, and those are direct quotes, and so they don't seek out support, and so the problems become entrenched. So specifically, when you've got that cyclical relationship, you can see how that becomes even more harmful. Another kind of another interesting finding around stigma, which I think can be explored more in further research, is the different experiences of stigma, and specifically in the use of the ONS measure, there were no kind of differences on who reported loneliness by, say, ethnicity, from the direct question on, you know, are you lonely? But through the indirect questions, ethnic minorities were more likely to say that they were experiencing loneliness. So that's an interesting kind of sub-finding around different experiences of stigma for different cultural backgrounds. And then just another point on the effectiveness of loneliness and mental health interventions. Lots of participants actually felt that interventions kind of targeted specifically at loneliness. They didn't say that they were necessarily effective, but what did work is where activities were kind of locally tailored and specific to certain characteristics of specific groups, so that people could, you know, bond over shared interests. So there are some good recommendations coming through from the research. That's just a bit of a flavour of some specific evidence gaps that were highlighted in the report and how this research has responded to them. Obviously, there are many other areas that we can all kind of look into further, but this is a bit of a demonstration of how the research work and specifically the evidence gaps report has influenced our work already. And just earlier today, we had a cross-government meeting of ministers that we've just relaunched to really galvanise cross-government work on tackling loneliness. And research like this, and much more broadly, is really helpful for us to help inform other departments and their work, and help them really embed loneliness and social isolation within their own policy making. So those are the kind of key things from me. And then just a couple of plugs, if I may, quickly. We have the Tackling Loneliness Hub as a space for people who work on loneliness to connect, to kind of share resources and updates. So please do join that if you haven't already, and there is a specific space for people who work in research. And just another, on behalf of the Department for Health and Social Care, they're developing a mental health and wellbeing plan, and loneliness features as part of that, and they've got a call for evidence that's live at the moment till I think the 7th of July. So please do check that out. I can share links if that's helpful, but just so that you're aware of that as well. Okay, thank you.
Okay, is that good? And Pam, are you all good?
Yeah, I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to you both. That was fantastic, and well covered with the public announcements going on in Whitehall at the moment. If you have any comments or questions for Pam and Rav, please do post them in the chat, and we'll come back to those at the end. And Rav, if you can share those links, that would be really, really fantastic. We'll move on to our second panelist now, or I should say third panelist actually now. We have Robin Hewings with us. Robin is Programme Director at the Campaign to End Loneliness, who've been working with our network throughout from its start. And the question we have posed to Robin is, from a third sector perspective, what do we need to do next to address loneliness and social isolation in the context of mental health? Robin, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, so I'm thinking about what would be most useful to say. I thought I might start with some things which I think are probably very top of mind for people who are working in the third sector, but I then would like to talk a bit more about things which are more focused on research, because I think that's probably more useful. So the things which are very top of mind for people working in the third sector will be about finance, money and stability, also the kind of structural drivers of loneliness. I think is very kind of clear and apparent to people working very closely on providing loneliness services, so the issues around socioeconomic inequality, low income and discrimination. I think people would also talk quite a lot about the value of the kind of network of services that supports social connection as what that goes alongside people who are trying to provide specific services for loneliness. So the kind of value of kind of buses and spaces to connect and so on. But thinking more precisely about research and mental health, I think that people working kind of in the third sector would say that there is real value in the research agenda that we have at the moment. It's really well, I think it's extremely well marshalled, particularly by the DCMS work, but I think that there's a kind of, it seems to me that there's a culture of trying to create really kind of practical research that can kind of support services in working out what they can do better, and also helping them to make their case for being funded. And I think that that requires work that we've seen today right across a whole range of areas, everything from the built environment, so quite kind of whole population level interventions, right through to very individualized services. And I think that people working in the third sector could often very much see the way in which loneliness and mental illness often interact. And I think the potential that people like Sonia Johnson talk about, that kind of adding social connection as a kind of an extra tool in the box for how we might help people is, I think, really, really important. I think that another area that people talk about a lot that relates to research is I think two issues around measurement, which is that people providing services find it very difficult to measure what they do well. I think, and I've just been doing some research with working with a funder and their grantees, and the funder said you've got to measure what you're doing, and none of the grantees did. And the only ones who did was because when they could see that asking the questions wasn't useful for their funder, it was useful for the person sat right in front of them. That would be why they would ask the questions. And so I think there's something, a really interesting task potentially, which is to work out how we can encourage people working in services to find ways of asking those questions in ways that don't seem to make sense to someone over there who you've never met and don't really care about, but the person in front of you who you care about massively, and how we can kind of find ways of bringing measurement into those kinds of kickoff conversations, which I think could be enable us to kind of collect data about what we're doing in loneliness as practitioners and also as researchers. And I think the kind of second part of that is, I think, finding measures that people find able to ask, and also that might be able to provide a more give a better understanding of what a service might reasonably be making a difference to. That when you kind of, if you're trying to make a difference to UCLA scores with a relatively light intervention, it's going to be quite discouraging because you probably won't. So how can we find out the things which are the kind of reliable proxy measures that people can collect and that are likely, and where it's a reasonable thing to think that they would have made a difference. So I think those would be the things. There's some big things at the top of mind running services, but it does absolutely go into research. I know that people working in the third sector massively value the research that's happening in this area and the massive increase in research that's happening. And to echo Rav's point, the Tackling Loneliness Hub is a great way to meet other people working in loneliness, either as researchers, which is growing, but also there's a rich set of people working in providing services who may well be able to kind of connect to in ways that could be really valuable for furthering your research agenda.
Okay, thanks, Robin. You still have a minute or so left if you want to say anything else. We'll leave it there, but I'm sure we'll come back to talk about some more things. But thanks so much for that, Robin. That was great, and lots of threads to pick up on at the end. So so finally, for this panel, we've got another duet. It's a panel of duets. So yeah, we're also joined by Bev Chip and Nick Barber. I think we've heard from Bev already throughout today. Nick, I don't think has had the opportunity to speak yet, so great to hear from Nick. And they're both fabulous members of our co-production group, or the COG, as we refer to it in the network. And the question we have posed to both Bev and Nick is, what do you think the priorities are for addressing loneliness and social isolation in the context of mental health? And how could we best support people to do this? Bev, are you going to start?
Yeah, I'll start. So I'm coming at this both as a lived experience researcher and as someone who currently uses mental health services. And it seems we've got mostly research people here today. So in the context of research, I think we need to look at social isolation and loneliness as separate entities much more, and particularly where there's one but not the other, and where there might have been a fairly recent change that creates this. For some people, these things are almost personality states that have been with them their whole life, but sometimes there's a change in character or behavior that means that you become socially isolated. I think prevention is more valuable than remedy, so we need to back up a bit and do some more qualitative exploration into the range of causes, and to take a psychological and a trauma-informed approach, to look at reclusivity and why people withdraw, the historic profile of their emotional connections, and looking at what might be underneath people's inability to bond or to make connections stick. I remember one friend who always said he was lonely, but seemed to have a really active social life, telling me a few years ago that he'd lost his Velcro, which puzzled me at first. But then in the context of the work with the network, I suddenly understood what that really meant. You can meet so many people, you can speak to them, there's nothing apparently wrong with you, but you just don't form that bond, that lasting relationship that turns into a deep friendship. I think there needs to be deeper research into the relationships between loneliness or social isolation and very specific things, including loss and trauma, domestic abuse, exposure to pornography, hoarding disorder, and simply social skills. Social skills training was mentioned earlier, and it might be needed for more people than are on the spectrum. It's quite a sensitive thing, but we mustn't ignore the elephant in the room. We've probably all known situations where someone we know hasn't been invited to some social do because of how they tend to behave. Going to frontline healthcare, I think we need to move beyond single interventions to take a much more holistic approach and an inquiring approach. It's not just about introducing people to activities. Are they able to socialise? Do they even have family or close friends? Who do they talk to? We need to encourage a whole variety of social connections, reconnections, and community engagement, however trivial or fleeting. For those people who are directly supporting people, don't pin all your hopes on one thing. Goal setting seems to be very common, but there'll be days when people won't feel up to a goal, say meeting a friend for a coffee, but they might be okay with other tiny things like just going to a library or a market where they're just around people, or speaking briefly to the bus driver or cashier. Even micro connections count. When we did the interviews, it became clear that people really valued the company of pets. And sometimes animals are the key to people opening up again, particularly those who've been really quite traumatized and find it hard to trust other human beings now. I know a couple who run an equine sanctuary in Ireland called Holly's Horsehaven, and they have a whole range of broken people coming there. And sometimes there are these incredible breakthroughs where a horse seems to be able to deeply connect with them and effect change and recovery, whereas years and whole strings of medical professionals have failed. So we have to be more open-minded about what could work. Never say nay. Over to Nick.
Thank you, Bev. I'd like to say from the outset how interesting it's been involved in the network right from the outset, and to come to the very end point like we are today, to see the research projects that we reviewed all those years ago before the pandemic, and now getting presentations from the people who carried out the research, and some feedback. Thinking about what the next steps might be, I think that there's a need to make frontline staff, people who are facing clients face to face, understand the complex interrelationship between loneliness, social isolation, and mental health. It's a two-way process. It's very complicated. Bev has alluded to this in her chat, and basically a holistic approach towards the patient, in which you understand, do they have people to talk to? Do they have friends and family? Are they on their own? What's the quality of their social engagement? These sorts of things need to be discussed with the patient on a face-to-face basis. The other thing which intrigued me during the whole period of this project was the idea of authentic connection. We were talking it's slightly related, but it's slightly distant, but still related. Community Navigator project, we were talking about the worry of sending people to mental health focused groups, and the resistance that certain clients might have to being sent to mental health focused groups, and the preference to be sent to interest focused groups that are open to the entire community. The reason being given that the connections that they would form at an interest-based group would be more authentic. And that sent me thinking about the idea of authenticity in human relationships. And this has only been touched on today, and I think it's actually quite fundamental, because an authentic connection is one where the loneliness is dispelled, whereas there are superficial connections which you can say, oh yes, you're doing loads of things, but you're not really hitting the button of addressing the feelings of loneliness. And I think it would be really interesting to try and get into the root of what constitutes an authentic and what constitutes an superficial connection. I don't know how you'd even begin to do that, but I'm just throwing it out there as an idea that has been puzzling me for my entire time with the COG. And on a final note, we've all been COVIDed. We've all been stuck indoors for 2 years. This conference, splendid as it's been, has been on Zoom. But as things have opened up in the last 2 or 3 months or so, I've realised how enjoyable it has been to be meeting people face to face. I spent a very pleasant afternoon yesterday in a friend's back garden, sitting in the sun, while his 2 kids that I've never met because they're 2 years old and 1-year-old running around in the back garden. And I thought, this is what I've been missing. You've got to get offline. You've got to put yourself out there. You've got to actually physically meet people. And I think that's a big hurdle for a lot of people with mental health issues. Nevertheless, that's the nettle that has to be grasped. That's my personal take home from the whole COVID experience. I hope my insights have been in some way useful and helpful. And it's been a very intriguing, interesting and enjoyable period of time working with the COG.
Well, thanks, Nick. It's a lovely way to also end our panel talks with someone such as yourself, who's been through the whole journey right from the start and the initiation of the network as well. So thanks for that. And Bev, thank you for invoking the more than human, the four-legged and furry friends that live around us. It's very, opens up lots of thoughts in terms of the imagination for future work, and to be a bit more open-minded. So now's the opportunity to open it up for discussion. So if anyone just wants to post a question for the whole panel and just put it in the Zoom chat, then please do that. Alternatively, if you can navigate your way around to the reactions and put up your virtual hand, please do that, and we'll let you just ask the question directly. But to begin with, I'll kick off with a question whilst we're waiting for other ones to come through for the panelists, if that's all right. And it sort of picks up on where Nick was ending up there around authentic connections, but also where we started with, I think, what you were saying, Rav, about the insights in terms of the evidence gaps around stigma. And I guess I'd like to ask a question about what might be the next steps in terms of how we might start addressing stigma, not just in terms of research, but also in terms of research around interventions and possibly new services. I was kind of also really intrigued by something that you said, Robin, about, you mentioned buses and spaces to connect, and these might not be things that are normally thought of as interventions for social isolation or loneliness, but clearly they have a massive impact on those. And we've also talked about, how we might start to prevent rather than just be proactive, and to be more proactive rather than prevent, rather than being responsive. So I don't know, how might we start to address, as a set of next steps, stigma? Who would like to go first?
I can kick off.
Yeah.
On stigma, a lot of our existing work as government is through comms and campaigns. So our most recent one was Lift Someone Out of Loneliness, specifically targeted at young people. And this might be the route that we go down increasingly, of targeting our kind of outreach interventions. But this campaign was our first as part of the NHS Better Health, Every Mind Matters campaign. And we found that really useful in terms of kind of making more of that link between mental health and loneliness, and making kind of resources and signposting to support much easier for people to access. So for us, that's how we're currently kind of targeting stigma. Again, reducing stigma is one of our kind of 3 strategic objectives. But we're conscious that obviously there's a lot going on, particularly across the voluntary sector, and we want to make sure that we're joining up a bit more in future, I think, to make the most of the messages that are going out. But also, I think something that I would like to explore a bit more, and this is something that came through the evidence gaps report as well, is those different experiences of stigma, and how, is it perhaps more helpful for services to use some words over others? And we've seen that with the use of the direct question on loneliness, that it's interpreted differently by different people. So so that's kind of our position at the moment, but we're really keen to see what kind of further work comes out around how people respond, how people kind of view their own experiences, and what is it that makes people kind of firstly recognise and then feel comfortable to talk about their feelings of loneliness?
Does anyone else want to build on that? Pam, I can see you've unmuted.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose with me, I'm coming from a perspective of thinking about young people, and quite a lot of the research on loneliness is suggesting that it's fueled by some feelings of loneliness are coming out because of prejudice. And we've just done a big an analysis of the PISA data and shown that actually school really matters for predicting loneliness, and it's to do with those experiences of prejudice within those environments. So kids who are not feeling like they fit are reporting higher levels of loneliness, and that comes through. It's come through today in some of the qualitative data that people have talked about, and I think for me it's to some extent about addressing stigma generally, not just about stigma around loneliness, but also thinking more about how we stigmatize individuals who might be different. And it's about creating those more inclusive spaces, whether they're in schools or they're in workplaces.
Can I add something? Yes, I mean, basically, it's a very tricky process, isn't it? Because in a sense, when you get, at school, when you get involved and dug into a project that you really enjoy, stigma evaporates. And in a way, it's all about finding for each child which is the circumstance in which they can dig themselves into a project sufficient to lose their self-consciousness in order to evaporate the stigma, if you see what I mean. I think this is the underlying philosophy behind the men's shed, but you could do it for school children as well, is that in a sense, if you got 12 men together in a shed, they'd sit round and not talk to each other. But if you say, look, the example given was, here's a lawnmower and it doesn't work, then, an hour later, they're all tinkering away and chatting with each other. The same underlying philosophy. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a behaviourist, but the same philosophy applied to school children can only be a good thing. When I was at school, we had a lot of after-school clubs. My school was recently closed and then reopened as an ARC academy. And they had an open day to which I attended. And some of my old teachers were there. And they said, what after-school activities do you do? And the ARC academy headmistress said, oh no, we shut at 5. When I was there in the 70s, every night you could have done something, electronics club, athletics, what have you. I think that's all about building bonds outside the formal classroom environment.
Yeah, and it also relates to the things that have come up through the panel so far around identifying or even forming shared interests.
Exactly.
which have very different labels associated with them than just necessarily being labelled as lonely. Bev, did you want to say anything? I see you've posted a couple of things in the chat.
Yeah, building on what Nick was saying, I think that there needs to be much more acceptance of difference, and maybe there can be education around tolerance of different views or different backgrounds or ways of whatever within schools, because it's always been a problem that people who are a bit different in any way get bullied. I was bullied because I had thick glasses, and kids will find something that is different about someone and then use that in a weaponized way. But it's worse now, because anyone who's on social media, which is probably most kids, will live in this virtual echo chamber where people who have the same views as them are fed into their social media feed. And so they think that they are right. This is how everyone is. This is how everyone thinks. This is how everyone should be. They don't get as much exposure to different types of people, different perspectives. And we also seem to be losing the ability to respectfully discuss and debate difference, because on social media, if someone says something you don't like, it's like block, cancel, you know, say something bad at them and then run away or just turn it off. You know, you don't have to stick with them and work it out. And so our negotiation skills, our conversation skills, our relationship skills are much more diminished since we've been spending time online. And I think the combination of all these things is making things in schools quite a hostile environment.
Pam, can see you've put up your hand.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I think Bev's absolutely right. And something that we've done, we finished a randomized control trial of, it was a social and emotional learning intervention for schools. And what we found there is we were actually focused on reducing mental health issues. Actually, we didn't find that much change there. There was some, but what we did find was that children were reporting reductions in loneliness, and they were talking about being able to manage their own loneliness better, but also help others manage that as well. And what they were being taught in those sessions, yes, was about mutual respect, but also learning about relationships, that actually relationships are often very, very difficult. And you can't, in a real face-to-face interaction, just block somebody because you don't like what they say. You've got to actually engage in some kind of communication with those individuals. So I think Bev's right. It is about teaching those important skills. I think kids have got them, but I think it's about ensuring that they are using them in their everyday encounters as well.
Some really great thoughts there. I feel like that conversation could go on for a long time, but I want to draw attention to a question that's in the chat. Georgina, I don't know if you wanted to just ask your question around the nitty issue of measures.
Yeah, I feel bad bringing this up because I've only been working in this sector since September, and every single thing I've attended, we've talked about the shortcomings of the measures, particularly for loneliness and social isolation. And I find myself thinking, well, let's do something different then. And I feel a bit like, is this just a conversation that has been going on forever and will continue to go on forever? Or are we realistically moving towards some new measures, better measures, different measures? I just was wondering about other people's optimism or pessimism on that.
Do you mind if, oh, go on, Robin, you go.
Oh, well, I was going to say, firstly, I think, Georgina, I didn't know if you wanted to say where you come. I know that you work for Re-Engage, but I didn't know if you wanted to kind of draw on Re-Engage's experience in this area.
Yeah, so I'm at Re-Engage. We work with over 75s, aiming to alleviate loneliness and social isolation. At the moment, we use ONS questions, UCLA 3, the single loneliness question. I want to do some work talking to some of our older people about what they understand by the questions and the things that factor into the way that they respond to those questions. But that would feel like a very tiny activity within a much bigger research machine. And so I'm kind of interested in people with a much longer history in this field. I'd love to hear, yeah, what you think about the likelihood of these measures changing, and the fact that particularly for charities and with funders, there's this pressure to be able to benchmark, and then that gives a kind of advantage to the longer standing measures, even though we recognize that they may not be that good in a lot of instances. So yeah, I'm just interested in people's responses to that.
Yeah, great. Sorry, I was just going to say that we kind of see a similar issue, and we want to do some focused work on it in the autumn. It's part of our kind of schedule, because we can just see there's an issue there. We don't really have a plan or a solution, but hopefully by creating some conversation with it, we can work out if there are useful things that can be done to have better benchmarks, better things that we can kind of agree that we should use. And obviously part of the impetus for that came from Pamela, who is also here. And I don't know.
Do you want to build on that?
Yeah,
then?
yeah. I mean, all I wanted to say was what Georgino spotted is that the problem that we've all known about. It is in the evidence gap review. There's newer information coming out to suggest that some of the big measurements are a real problem, particularly if we're wanting to look at lifespan. What we have recommended in a recent paper is actually the 4-item UCLA seems to be really quite good. The ONS ones, we just need to do more research on to see whether they're effective for people or understood in the same way by different people. I mean, the key problem with the measures we've got on loneliness is that they actually weren't developed with lonely people. So the experiences and the behavioral stuff that's described in the items actually doesn't necessarily fit. I mean, there's a paper coming out soon by Marlies Mays, who I don't think is part of our network. She's based in the Netherlands at the moment. And what she did was get a group of researchers together to basically assess all of the measures the most popular measures of loneliness for adults. And you know what? We were often saying we were not interpreting the items in the same way. And that's a problem if we're not doing it as researchers. We should have a really clear idea of what these items, which areas of loneliness these items are tapping. And yet there is a problem. So I think it's not necessarily about going back to basics, because I think now we've got a lot more qualitative studies so that people have already given us lots of ideas about how these items are not necessarily measuring what they think loneliness is. But I think, yeah, what we shouldn't be doing is using those same measures all the time, because we're just not getting good data. We need to be thinking about whether we need to change them in some way. The Ending Loneliness Together group in Australia have done quite a bit of work as well, and they are recommending the 4-item loneliness measure. But it's a debate we all keep having, and hopefully together we can kind of move things forward.
Yeah, there's a really interesting comment in the chat there from I think Manal about the creation of UCLA, which is both worrisome but also creates a little bit of a giggle. Nick, sorry, you've had your hand up for a little while.
Yeah, yes. I mean, from a service user and lived experience perspective, there's a bogus objectivity in the measures, I think. And I can understand why we have measures, and I understand why they're useful for research. But I think there's a fundamental disconnect with lived experience, because as somebody goes through various periods in their life, the way that they respond to the questionnaires from which the measures are compiled changes. And I don't know what the answer is, but I can't help thinking that boiling down somebody's subjective experience into what appears to be objective numerical data is always going to be very problematic. I don't really see how that circle can be properly squared. Am I more lonely than you? You know, are the people of Birmingham more lonely than the people of Nottingham? It's a very strange question to be asking in many ways. I'm not offering answers. I'm just throwing out more questions here, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and I suppose it's also a challenge of how transitory loneliness can be, and temporal, you know, as well.
Because it varies from day to day, week to week, year to year as well. Yeah. So.
Sonia, did you want to come in, and because you posted a comment there about the costs of you know, changing and switching measures?
Yeah, I mean, only really the sort of pragmatic point that with the 4-item measure that seems to be performing not so badly and being used very widely, given it so brief, there's probably some merit in continuing for now to use that, but in trying to develop and add on to it sort of more subtle and co-produced kind of measures that explore specific aspects of the experience of loneliness and what kind of loneliness people are actually experiencing and how it relates to their mental health and that sort of thing. But it is interesting, we don't seem to have got anywhere with developing those sort of measures so far. I'm not aware of too much at all that's going on. So yeah, we do need some movement on that, but maybe to add rather than immediately abandon these very short measures that we've managed to get that are now being used in lots of contexts.
Maybe that's the job for the next network. What comes next? What comes next? So we've got a couple of minutes left. So rather than bringing in another question, I just want to go quickly around the panelists. And I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here, just to see if there's a final thought that you want to share with us all as we're coming to the end of the day, in particular in terms of these next steps. I guess if there was the one thing that you think we should do next as a priority, if there could only be one thing, because obviously this is such a huge, complex challenge, what should that be? And I'm going to go around in order of the folks that I started off with the panel earlier. So I'll come to Pam first.
Okay, I'm not going to pick a particular topic area. Instead, what I'm going to suggest is that actually we do more collaborative work. We work together more so that we get better data and that we get better output.
Great. Rav.
Very much the same point around coordination, I think. Please do look at the evidence gaps report that the evidence group brilliantly pulled together and that we've published on gov.uk and on the hub, as well as the What Works Centre Wellbeing site. And through that exercise, we're also updating the data set. So ultimately, the point is around kind of seeing what's there. A bit of kind of coordination and collaboration would be great, so that then we as government can make it a bit easier for everyone else kind of on the ground who's trying to make the most effective and impactful lowest targeted service.
Brilliant, thanks, Rav. Collaboration and coordination. It does feel like you're going to need another research network. We need another Ellie going forward. That's the most important thing. Robin.
I would agree with that, but to kind of build on it, I think what I'd say is that I think it's really important that we acknowledge the progress that there has been in this area, particularly around public recognition, and also really significantly in research. We know vastly more than we did a decade ago, but continue to make the case that this is a really serious issue that needs to be addressed through research, but also increasingly by putting that research into action. So I think we need to be kind of positive about what's been achieved, but kind of hungry for more.
Bev.
I think solutions that are community focused and not under any kind of mental health banner are really valuable to avoid stigma, find out what's happening, what's open to everyone. And I know that some people have actually said to me that they don't want to go to any service user groups or activities for people with mental health problems, because being around other people with mental health problems reminds them that they are ill and they want to be better. So they need to be surrounded by more positive people. And it's about sustainability, just, you know, becoming part of the ordinary community in your local area and returning to normal life is part of your recovery.
And last word to you, Nick.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think the focus, well, one thing I've learned through all of the research projects we've looked through is the importance of grassroots, community-based, interest-based activities in which people are reintegrated into society. This overlaps a great deal with what Bev's just said, but it's basically reintegrating people who have suffered distress into everyday society through shared interests, shared locality, shared cultural interests, it could be, doesn't matter. It's about getting people out, doing things communally and together.
What a wonderful, wonderful set of words for us to end on. So thank you again to all of the panelists for this session. A round of virtual applause or things like that through reactions would be very, very much appreciated. Thank you, everyone. We'll end the panel here, but I believe now I'm handing back over to Alexandra, who's going to guide us through another Mentimeter session.
Yeah, we've got another Mentimeter, and just to remind you all that you get one vote, and you've got about 250 characters, I think. So I'm going to pose you the question: what are the next steps for addressing loneliness, social isolation, and mental ill health? And Ellie's going to share her screen to give you the Mentimeter. No, she's going to share it with me, show me the results, but somebody, Millie, is going to post the Mentimeter link now. There we go. So we've got some really interesting answers coming up. We've got people trying to find, again, just to distinguish between loneliness and social isolation. So looking at people who want to be isolated, are there very good reasons for them wanting to be isolated, or actually are they distressed in that isolation? And I think there's a couple of people who can't get into it. Nick, if you just copy and paste the link from the chat, maybe into a new browser, it might work. Ellie's just posted it again. And people are bringing up this collaboration point again that was brought up by the panelists. And again, this idea that interventions are sustainable, they're not going to be provided in your local area for 6 months and then it all stops, or you get no support after it. More investigation of community assets. And again, this was something we've talked about a lot in terms of thinking about interventions being provided at a local level. Somebody was pointing out the importance of establishing a robust evidence base for social prescribing, and we're about to publish a review on that. Important to collaborate with voluntary sector providers, and again, I think our PLUS projects have modelled that very well. Robust evaluation of interventions, and again, we talked about how to overcome potential challenges in trials. Talking to people instead of writing about them, again, that's a really important point. And I think the issue of stigma has come up again and again, and this idea of things being done to you because there's something wrong with you is probably not very acceptable and not likely to be something that's a sustainable intervention. Social prescribing is certainly something which has a very collaborative model, and something in which, as Roz was highlighting before, there's the potential for lots of different components to that, whether psychological or social. Nick, did you find it was working now?
No, it repeatedly just goes to this site cannot be reached, connection reset. So it doesn't worry, because I've
pasted it in. Yeah. So you want us to think more about authenticity and human relationships,
Exactly so.
and how best to build them, yeah, and you brought that up in your presentation. Somebody's made a point about using games, so interventions that kind of force you to think about things, perhaps to challenge cognitions. And we haven't really talked about that very much today. That's a really interesting next step.
If I may, it was my comment, and I wrote that because it was something I experienced personally during the pandemic. When we moved here for our masters, we couldn't meet people, and the only way I was able to find friends or able to talk to some people was through online gaming events, which our accommodation hosted. Yep.
That's really interesting, thank you. Somebody's talked about large-scale information, and I think that at the start of the network, we had these very grand ambitions for identifying these data sets where you could, look at genetic factors, structural factors, cultural factors, personality, individual differences, and try and do some work to understand why certain people become lonely and why certain people have worse mental health outcomes as a result. And I don't think we've made some progress, but I think that's something that is, another next step for us. We've done a lot of groundwork, but I think there's a lot more progress to be made there. Avoiding getting too fixed on the gold standard of the RCT. And I think there are certain interventions which are very difficult to evaluate using the kind of gold standard RCT approach. And for example, if you think about an urban regeneration project, if you think about, the regeneration of King's Cross, for example, it's really hard to think about how you'd evaluate using an RCT design. And for those kinds of interventions, we need to think about more creative approaches to evaluating the effectiveness of interventions. Bringing in an understanding of the psychology of loneliness to a much wider range of services and policies. Did the person who posed that want to just comment on that further?
Yeah, so I wrote that. This is Robin from the Campaign to End. So I think that you can just see it as a theme, whether it's probably much in social prescribing or kind of services which seem like they are just trying to increase people's social connections, that if you try to understand how being lonely makes people more fearful of social interaction, the kind of support that people might need to get through the front door and also to stay engaged, you can kind of therefore do things about loneliness, not just on things which are in any way badged as loneliness, but make that much, much more common. You can have a really useful effect.
Very interesting, thank you. So it's now 10 to 5, and we're going to just move now to our final presentation, which is where I'm just going to round up today and talk to you about, we've talked a bit about your views on next steps, and we've been thinking about this a lot and gathering views because we need to think about our own next steps as an organisation. So I'm just going to share my screen and show you, hang on a minute, it's not showing the whole. Here we go. So can people see those slides? Yeah, great. So I'm just rounding up today and thanking people for staying on in this 27 degrees here in London. So we are, we were officially due to end in July, but we managed to get a no-cost extension, which is great because it gives us a bit of time. And we're really hoping to continue the work that we've done and to continue this capacity building and to use these connections that we've seen very clearly today as a platform for future funding applications for all of you here and for anybody else who's interested in this area of research. And we're really keen to continue supporting substantial applications in the future. So we're going to be, continuing our website, and we really hope that by continuing to archive useful resources and publications, voluntary sector organisations will find it useful to put together a business case for providing interventions. People putting together grants will find it useful in putting together their justification. And we're also hoping, and we haven't worked out the sort of nitty-gritty of this, but that we can continue providing access to our co-production group, because they've done such a lot of work over the last few years, and it seems a real pity to just stop it there. Of course, it's very contingent on funding and people who wish to be put in touch with lived experience researchers through the co-production group, which we're seeing as a kind of dating agency type model, and would obviously be able to fund them appropriately as per involved rates. So the kind of activities we hope to offer would be continue to provide a place to connect with potential collaborators. So even though Ellie is sadly leaving, and I'll come to that in a minute, we do have a little bit of administrative time, so we can hopefully involve members of our department in collating about 3 newsletters a year. And those will continue, not quite the sort of platinum version that you've been receiving to date, but hopefully send you out some recent research, news of funding calls and events. And again, this practice of saying, John Vines is looking for somebody to collaborate with him, do you want to get in touch with him? So that's a really useful way to put people in touch with each other. And we've matched a lot of people over the last few years. And hopefully to also do an event similar to this, in which we can showcase recent research and bring people together. So, I hope you've all seen our website, and there are different tabs there on which you can see the different resources, and also join the mailing list there and the Slack channel. And of course, we're only one of 8 research networks that were funded around the same time. And we haven't said much about the work we've done with all the other networks, apart from those who are obviously represented here. You can see Simon Gilbody here. And all of us are very much collaborating to think about the legacy of these networks and the mental health. And McPin have been really helpful in pulling together a campaign. The hashtag is Mental Health Research Matters, to really bring our research findings out to stakeholders. So do follow all the other networks and use that hashtag to see what the plans are for all those other networks, which should each, have their own legacy. So we're really at the end now, and I really wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. It's been great to see everybody, and all the speakers and panelists have put a lot of work into their presentations. The chairs have focused their concentration, as have us tweeters and breakout room helpers. And it's been fantastic to hear from the co-production group, and also all the Plus project teams, and to be supported by the mental health and Mark Brown. And on the right, we've got all of the people who've been working with us all along, including our advisory group and all the co-investigators and our amazing network coordinators. So thank you so much to them, and of course our funders who've made all this possible. I wanted to say goodbye to Ellie, and Ellie and Mary joined at the beginning, job sharing the network coordinator role, and Mary's role came to an end after 18 months as planned, and she's now working on the Finch study at UCL, which is great. But Ellie is moving on to do clinical training, but of course is still very much a member of the network. And so we really want to thank her for organising today and for all the work she's been doing, and particularly for our co-production group and co-investigators. So thank you very much, everybody. I leave you with a memory of a very hot but interesting day, and do catch up with sessions that you've missed on Twitter.